The stage was 3 days late, and Lydia Hartwell's fiancé was never coming. She knew it the moment the station master stopped meeting her eyes, the moment the other passengers began whispering behind their hands, the moment her last coin disappeared into the landlady's palm for another night in a room that smelled of defeat. 27 years old, educated, respectable, and abandoned at a godforsaken stage stop in Wyoming territory with nothing but a carpetbag and a stack of love letters written by a man who didn't exist. The frontier had a way of exposing every lie a woman told herself about her worth. Stay with me through this story of betrayal, justice, and the courage it takes to stop waiting for someone else to save you. Comment below with your city so I can see how far Lydia's journey travels, because her story might be closer to home than you think. The wind came down off the mountains like a living thing, cold and persistent, carrying the smell of sage and dust and distance. Lydia pulled her shawl tighter and watched the horizon from the wooden bench outside Morrison's stage stop, the same bench she'd occupied for 72 hours, wearing a groove in her hope with every passing minute. The letter crinkled in her pocket, soft from repeated folding. She didn't need to read it again. Every word was burned into her memory. My dearest Lydia, the ranch is ready, the preacher is waiting, and my heart has room for only you. Come to Lodgepole Station, Wyoming Territory, and I will make you my wife the moment you arrive. Your devoted Thomas Whitmore. Devoted. The word tasted bitter now. Still here, Miss Hartwell? The station master's voice carried false cheer, the kind men used when they pitied you, but didn't want the burden of actually helping. He stood in the doorway of the station house, wiping his hands on a stained apron, his eyes sliding away from her face. Mr. Morrison. Lydia kept her voice level, refusing to let him hear the tremor underneath. Has anyone come asking for passengers? A man, perhaps, looking for someone expected on Monday's stage? Morrison scratched his jaw, uncomfortable. No, ma'am. No one's come asking. 3 days. Monday's stage had arrived right on schedule, depositing Lydia and her carefully packed hopes onto this desolate stretch of nothing. Tuesday, she'd waited with confidence. Wednesday, with concern. Today, Thursday, she waited with the growing certainty that Thomas Whitmore, whoever he really was, had no intention of honoring the promises he'd written in such elegant script. I see. Lydia stood, brushing dust from her traveling dress, a deep green wool that had seemed so practical in Philadelphia. Here, it was just another piece of evidence that she didn't belong. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. She walked toward the small room she'd rented behind the station house, each step measured and careful, because if she moved too quickly, she might shatter. Inside, the space was barely larger than a closet. A narrow bed, a washstand, a single window that looked out on nothing but prairie grass bending under the weight of wind. Her carpetbag sat in the corner, still mostly packed. She'd been so certain this was temporary, just a brief pause before her real life began. Lydia sat on the bed and pulled out her reticule, counting the coins inside for the third time that day. $4.30. The room cost 50 cents a night. Meals another $1 a day if she was careful. By her calculation, she had less than a week before she'd be destitute in a territory that had no patience for destitute women. The mirror above the washstand showed her a face she barely recognized, pale, drawn, dark circles under gray eyes that had once sparkled with intelligence and humor. Her brown hair, usually pinned in a neat coiffure, had started to escape its pins, wisps curling around her temples. She looked like what she was, a fool who'd believed that loneliness could be solved by answering an advertisement in the Matrimonial Times. Established rancher in Wyoming territory, seeks educated woman of good character for marriage. Must be willing to embrace frontier life and partnership in building a prosperous future. Romance and respect guaranteed. Romance and respect guaranteed. As if either could be promised in a letter, sealed with wax, sent to a woman desperate enough to believe. Lydia had been that desperate. After her father's death 2 years ago, after the reading of a will that left everything to her married brother, after months of living on relatives' charity while teaching in a finishing school that paid barely enough for room and board, she'd been desperate enough to write back. Desperate enough to spend her meager savings on a train ticket west. Desperate enough to believe that Thomas Whitmore's letters, arriving weekly with perfect regularity, meant something real. A knock at the door made her jump. "Miss Hartwell?" Morrison's voice, even more uncomfortable than before. "There's someone here to see you." Her heart lurched. Thomas. It had to be Thomas, finally arrived with a reasonable explanation for the delay. Illness, business trouble, weather that had closed the mountain passes. She stood quickly, smoothing her dress, reaching for the small hat she'd removed earlier. But when she opened the door, Morrison stood alone in the narrow hallway, and his expression stopped her from hoping. "He's in the station house," Morrison said quietly. "But, Miss Hartwell, he's not who you've been waiting for." The main room of Morrison's stage stop smelled of coffee and leather and the unwashed bodies of travelers who'd passed through on their way to somewhere that mattered. A pot-bellied stove radiated heat in the corner. Several rough tables and chairs occupied the center space. And standing by the window, hat in his hands, was a man who looked like the territory itself had shaped him. Tall, lean, weathered, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of winter sky. He turned when she entered, and something in his expression made her stop walking. Not pity. Pity she'd seen enough of. This was something harder. Recognition, maybe. Or regret. "Miss Hartwell." His voice was low, carefully neutral. "My name is Jonah Callahan. I own a ranch about 20 miles north of here." He paused, rotating the hat brim through his fingers. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but Thomas Whitmore isn't coming." The words should have devastated her. Instead, they settled over her shoulders like a weight she'd already been carrying, finally acknowledged. "I know." That surprised him. She saw it in the slight lift of his eyebrows, the way his grip on his hat tightened. "You know. I've known since Tuesday." Lydia walked to one of the tables and sat down. Not because she needed to, but because standing felt like pretending she had dignity left to protect. "What I don't know is why you're here to tell me." Jonah Callahan crossed the room and took the chair across from her, moving with the deliberate care of a man who'd learned to approach frightened things without spooking them. Up close, she could see the scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the lines around his eyes that came from squinting into too much sun, the shadows underneath that spoke of sleep lost to darker things than weather. "Because Thomas Whitmore isn't his real name," Jonah said quietly. "It's one of about a dozen names he uses. David Graham, Robert Fletcher, William St. Clair. He's a confidence man, Miss Hartwell. He makes his living off women like you, educated, alone, desperate enough to believe a stranger's promises." The room tilted slightly. Lydia gripped the edge of the table. "Women like me." "I didn't mean—" Jonah stopped, jaw tightening. "I meant women who deserve better than what they've been given. Women who should be able to trust a letter signed with a promise of marriage." "But we can't." The words came out flat, empty of emotion because she'd used up all her feeling over the past 3 days. "We can't trust any of it." "No, ma'am." "You can't." Jonah leaned forward, his forearms on the table, his expression intent. "He's been working this territory for 5 years that I know of, probably longer. He places advertisements in Eastern newspapers, writes letters to women who respond, convinces them to travel west with whatever money they have. Sometimes he shows up long enough to get his hands on their savings before disappearing. More often, he just leaves them stranded." Lydia thought of her carpet bag, packed with everything she owned. The small inheritance from her mother that she'd sewn into the lining of her winter coat, insurance against complete destitution. "How much do they usually bring?" "Enough." Jonah's voice went hard. "Enough to make it worth his while. He's particular about his victims. Never women with family who'll come looking, never women with resources to fight back, just women who are—" He stopped again, searching for words. "Invisible," Lydia finished. "Women who won't be missed." "Yes." The silence between them filled with everything that word meant. Outside, the wind rattled the window glass. The stove popped and settled. Morrison moved around behind them, making unnecessary noise with cups and saucers. "Why are you telling me this?" Lydia finally asked. "Why do you care about one more invisible woman who fell for a con man's lies?" Something shifted in Jonah Callahan's expression, a crack in the careful control, a glimpse of something raw underneath. "Because 6 years ago, my sister answered an advertisement from a man calling himself Thomas Whitmore. She traveled from Missouri to Colorado Territory with her savings and her hope. I haven't seen her since." The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through everything Lydia thought she understood about this conversation. This wasn't charity. It wasn't even kindness. This was something else entirely. Your sister. Lydia's throat tightened. What happened to her? I don't know. Jonah's hands curled into fists on the table. That's the truth. She wrote me one letter after she arrived, saying she'd met Thomas and the wedding was planned for the following week. Then nothing. I came looking 6 months later, but the address she'd given me didn't exist. No one in Denver City had heard of Thomas Whitmore or a woman matching Emma's description. It was like she'd stepped off the stage and vanished. You think he killed her? I think he's capable of it. Jonah met her eyes, and Lydia saw the weight he carried, years of searching, years of not knowing, years of guilt that he hadn't stopped his sister before she'd left. But I also think he's smart enough to avoid murder when there are easier ways to make women disappear. He might have sold her to a brothel, might have married her and abandoned her in some mining camp where no one asked questions, might have just taken her money and left her stranded like he left you, and Emma was too ashamed to write home. Each possibility was its own kind of horror. Lydia closed her eyes briefly, thinking of this man's sister, a woman who'd probably felt exactly what Lydia had felt when she'd opened Thomas Whitmore's first letter. Hope. The dangerous, desperate kind that made you believe in romance and respect guaranteed. You've been looking for him, Lydia said. Not a question. For 6 years. Every time I hear about a woman answering a matrimonial advertisement in this territory, I follow the trail. Sometimes I'm too late. Sometimes there's nothing to find but another abandoned woman and another empty promise. Jonah straightened in his chair, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a determination that made her believe him. But this time, I think I can catch him. How? Because you're still here. Jonah pulled a folded piece of paper from his vest pocket and spread it on the table between them. It was a wanted poster, edges worn from handling, but the printed description was clear enough. Man of average height and build, age 35 to 45, brown hair, clean-shaven, well-spoken, possibly using the aliases Thomas Whitmore, David Graham, Robert Fletcher. Wanted for fraud and theft. Reward $200. Lydia stared at the poster, at the generic description that could fit 100 men. You want me to identify him? More than that. Jonah leaned forward again, his eyes intent on her face. I want you to help me trap him. The words hung in the air between them, impossible and compelling at the same time. Outside, the afternoon stage rolled in with a thunder of hooves, and the drivers shouted greeting. Passengers disembarked, their voices carrying through the walls. Complaints about the dust, questions about the schedule, the ordinary concerns of people whose lives were proceeding according to plan. Lydia thought about her $4.30, her carpet bag packed with everything she owned, her brother's house in Philadelphia, where she might be able to return if she could scrape together the train fare and swallow enough pride to ask for charity. She thought about the finishing school where she'd taught deportment and needlework to girls who would never need to support themselves, girls who would never answer matrimonial advertisements because their futures were already secured by family and fortune. She thought about Emma Callahan, who'd written one letter and then disappeared into the vast silence of the frontier. How? Lydia asked. Relief flickered across Jonah's face, brief but unmistakable. He's smart, but he's also arrogant. Men like him always are. He thinks the women he targets are too ashamed or too powerless to fight back. He thinks he's untouchable. He's right, isn't he? Lydia gestured at the wanted poster. $200 for 6 years of crime. That's not exactly justice. It's not enough, Jonah agreed. But it's a start. And if we can catch him here, with evidence that he's still running cons, we can make sure he goes to trial. We can make sure other women know his face, his methods. We can make sure Emma's name is part of the charges, even if I never find her. And what makes you think he'll come back here? Lydia kept her voice steady, even as her heart started to beat faster. I'm stranded now. I have nothing left to take. He doesn't know that. Jonah pulled out another letter, this one written in the same elegant script as the ones Lydia had received. Morrison got this yesterday, addressed to you. I convinced him to let me see it first. Lydia took the letter with trembling fingers and read, My dearest Lydia, I am devastated to have missed your arrival. Ranch business kept me in the mountains longer than expected, and I have only just learned of the stage's arrival. I will come for you tomorrow evening, and we will proceed directly to the preacher. Forgive the delay. Your devoted Thomas. Tomorrow evening, less than 24 hours. Lydia set the letter down carefully, her mind racing through possibilities and consequences. What do you need me to do? Act like you still believe him. Jonah's voice went soft, almost apologetic. I know what I'm asking. I know it means staying in that belief for a little while longer, letting him think he's won. But if he shows up expecting a grateful bride, he'll be relaxed, confident. That's when men make mistakes. And then? Then I arrest him. Jonah tapped the badge pinned to his vest, so tarnished Lydia hadn't noticed it before. I'm a deputy territorial marshal. I have the authority to take him into custody, and I have enough evidence from other cases to make charges stick. But I need him here, in the act of continuing his fraud. I need him to try to take something from you, even if it's just your trust, so there's no question about his intent. Lydia looked at the badge, then at Jonah Callahan's face, trying to read the truth underneath his controlled expression. He was asking her to be bait, asking her to smile at a man who'd lied to her, to pretend she was still the desperate, invisible woman who'd believed in romance and respect guaranteed, asking her to risk whatever small dignity she had left on the chance that justice might finally catch up with Thomas Whitmore. If I do this, Lydia said slowly, and he realizes it's a trap, what then? Then I'll be close enough to stop him before he can hurt you. Jonah's jaw tightened. I won't let him hurt you, Miss Hartwell. You have my word. A promise from a stranger. The irony wasn't lost on her, but there was something in Jonah Callahan's eyes that Thomas Whitmore's letters had never contained, a recognition that she was a whole person, capable of making her own choices even when those choices were dangerous. He wasn't offering to save her. He was offering her a chance to fight back. I'll do it, Lydia said. Not for the reward money, not even for your sister, though God knows she deserves better than vanishing into silence. She met Jonah's eyes across the scarred table and felt something cold and hard settling into place inside her chest, where hope used to live. I'll do it because I'm tired of being the woman who waits. I'm tired of being invisible. And I'm tired of men like Thomas Whitmore getting away with turning women's desperation into profit. Jonah's expression shifted, respect replacing relief. All right then, we'll do this together. He stood and extended his hand across the table. No more waiting, ma'am. Lydia took his hand, feeling the calluses from years of ranch work, the strength in his grip that came from labor rather than violence. His hand was warm and steady and real in a way that Thomas Whitmore's letters had never been. No more waiting, she echoed. And for the first time in 3 days, Lydia Hartwell felt something other than shame. It wasn't hope. She was done with hope, done with the dangerous belief that someone else would fix her broken circumstances. This was something harder and more honest. This was anger, cold and clear and purposeful. Thomas Whitmore had made a mistake when he'd left her stranded with just enough time to stop believing his lies. He'd made an even bigger mistake, assuming she'd be too ashamed to fight back. Tomorrow evening, when he arrived with his practiced smile and his empty promises, he'd discover what it cost to underestimate an invisible woman. The rest of that day passed in careful preparation. Jonah left Morrison's station before sunset, promising to return the next afternoon with backup, another marshal from Lodgepole, a man he trusted. He gave Lydia a small Derringer pistol and showed her how to load it, how to carry it concealed in her skirt pocket, how to fire it if the worst happened. I don't think you'll need it, Jonah said, checking the chambers one more time before handing it to her. But I learned a long time ago that thinking isn't the same as knowing. Better to have it and not need it than the other way around. Lydia held the small weapon, feeling its weight in her palm. She'd never touched a gun before. In Philadelphia, ladies didn't handle weapons. They relied on fathers and brothers and husbands for protection. The frontier apparently had different rules. Thank you, she said, slipping the Derringer into her pocket, where it settled against her thigh like a secret. Get some rest tonight if you can, Jonah advised, settling his hat back on his head. Tomorrow's going to be long. He paused at the door, turning back. Miss Hartwell, what you're doing takes courage. Real courage, not the kind that comes from having no other choice. I want you to know I see that. Then he was gone, riding north into the gathering darkness, leaving Lydia alone with her thoughts and the cold comfort of a loaded pistol. She didn't sleep. How could she? Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Thomas Whitmore's imagined face. Handsome, probably, with the kind of smile that made women feel chosen. She tried to picture Emma Callahan, younger version of her brother, brown-haired and hopeful, stepping off a stage in Denver City with her heart full of trust. Where was she now? Alive or dead? Broken or merely lost? And what would Lydia's own fate have been if Thomas Whitmore had actually shown up on Monday? Would he have taken her small inheritance and disappeared? Would he have married her long enough to get his hands on anything else of value? Or would he have simply explained that the ranch didn't exist, the preacher had moved on, and perhaps she should go back east before winter made travel impossible, leaving her stranded anyway, but with his conscience clear because he'd technically told the truth? The questions chased themselves through her mind until dawn grayed the window. Friday morning arrived with low clouds and the smell of rain. Lydia dressed carefully in her second-best dress, a brown calico that seemed appropriately Grateful Bride-ish without being so fine that Thomas would immediately suspect she had money worth stealing. She pinned her hair up neatly, added the small cameo brooch that had been her mother's, and practiced her expression in the mirror until she could produce something that looked like nervous joy. It felt like costuming herself for a play, which, she supposed, was exactly what she was doing. Morrison served her breakfast, eggs and cornbread and coffee so strong it made her teeth ache, and didn't ask questions. Either Jonah had explained the situation, or Morrison had developed a frontier sense of when to mind his own business. Lydia ate mechanically, forcing food down a throat tight with anxiety. Mid-morning, Jonah returned with another man in tow, Marshall Davis, older and grayer, but with the same weathered competence that characterized Jonah. They spoke quietly in the corner while Lydia pretended to read a month-old newspaper, catching fragments of their conversation. Known to be armed. Multiple warrants. Won't expect resistance. By afternoon, the tension in Morrison's station had wound tight as a spring. Davis positioned himself in the back room with a clear line of sight to the main area. Jonah took a chair near the window, angled so he'd see anyone approaching from the road. Morrison busied himself with tasks that kept him moving, nervous energy finding outlet in unnecessary cleaning. And Lydia waited. The irony wasn't lost on her. After 3 days of unwanted waiting, she was choosing to wait again. But this waiting had purpose. This waiting had teeth. The light outside slowly shifted from afternoon gold to evening amber. Shadows lengthened across the floorboards. Lydia's hands remained folded in her lap, outwardly calm, while inside her thoughts raced through every possibility, every way this could go wrong. Then, just as the sun touched the horizon, horse hooves sounded on the road. Jonah's hand moved subtly to his gun. Davis shifted position in the back room, out of sight but ready. Morrison froze mid-wipe of a table that was already clean, and Lydia stood, smoothing her skirt, feeling the weight of the derringer in her pocket, and walked to the door to meet her fiancé. The man who dismounted from a fine bay gelding was exactly what she'd imagined, tall enough to be impressive, handsome enough to be convincing, dressed in clothes that suggested prosperity without ostentation. Brown hair, clean-shaven, warm smile that crinkled the corners of his blue eyes. He removed his hat with a flourish and approached with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his welcome. Lydia. His voice was rich, apologetic, perfectly calibrated to disarm suspicion. My dearest Lydia, I cannot tell you how sorry I am for the delay. She made herself smile, made herself take a step forward, made herself speak in the breathless tone of a woman whose dreams were finally coming true. Thomas, you came. Of course I came. He took her hands, his touch warm and steady and utterly false. Did you doubt me? Yes, she thought. I doubted you completely by Wednesday morning, and by Thursday, I knew you were a liar, and now I'm going to watch while justice catches up with your charming smile. I was worried, she said instead, letting just enough tremor into her voice. 3 days is a long time to wait. Far too long, and entirely my fault. He squeezed her hands gently, his expression earnest. Ranch business in the mountains, a dispute with a neighboring claim that required my presence. I came as quickly as I could. His eyes searched her face, and she wondered what he was looking for. Signs of doubt? Evidence that she still had money worth taking? But I'm here now, and we'll proceed just as planned. The preacher is waiting in Lodgepole. We can reach the ranch by tomorrow afternoon. Something in the way he said ranch made her certain it didn't exist. Or if it did, it belonged to someone else entirely. She thought of Emma Callahan, who'd believed the same lies, who'd climbed into a wagon or mounted a horse and ridden away from safety toward a future that had swallowed her whole. I'm ready, Lydia said. I've been ready since Monday. Then let's not wait another moment. Thomas glanced around Morrison Station, his gaze passing over Jonah without recognition, just another cowboy occupying space. Gather your things, my dear. We'll stay in Lodgepole tonight and marry in the morning. Actually, Lydia said, letting her voice shake a little, before we go, there's something I need to show you, something my mother left me. I thought you should see it before we marry. Interest flickered in Thomas's eyes, brief but unmistakable. Of course. Whatever you wish. She led him inside toward the table where she'd left her carpet bag, feeling his presence behind her like a wolf following a rabbit. Jonah shifted slightly in his chair. In the back room, Davis would be watching, waiting for the signal. Lydia reached into her carpet bag and pulled out the small wooden box where she kept her mother's jewelry. A few pieces, nothing valuable, but Thomas didn't know that. She opened the lid, showing him the cameo brooch she wasn't wearing, a pair of pearl earrings, a simple gold ring. My mother wanted me to have something beautiful for my wedding day, Lydia said softly. These were hers. They're all I have left of her. Thomas looked down at the jewelry, and Lydia saw the calculation in his eyes, assessing value, planning deception. When he looked up, his expression was tender, perfectly crafted. They're lovely, Lydia, but you're already beautiful enough without ornaments. Save them for our daughter someday. Our daughter. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that Lydia felt rage bloom hot in her chest. This man had probably told the same lie to a dozen women, had probably looked at Emma Callahan with the same false tenderness. There's more, Lydia said, and pulled out the winter coat with her inheritance sewn into the lining. Thomas's eyes sharpened. More jewelry? Money. Lydia met his gaze directly, letting him see exactly what he wanted to see. A naive woman revealing her only resource to the man she trusted. $300. Everything my mother left me. I sewed it into the coat lining for safety on the journey. She paused, letting uncertainty creep into her voice. I thought we might need it for the ranch, for supplies, or $300. Thomas's mask slipped just slightly, greed flickering underneath the charm. That's very wise, my dear, very wise to keep it safe. His hand moved toward the coat. Why don't you let me hold it? I'll make sure it reaches the ranch securely. Actually, Jonah's voice cut through the room like a blade. Why don't you keep your hands where I can see them, Mr. Whitmore? Or should I say Mr. Graham, or Fletcher, or St. Clair? Thomas spun, his hand dropping to his side, and in that instant, every trace of warmth vanished from his face. The mask didn't crack. It simply fell away, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. I don't know what you're talking about. Marshal Jonah Callahan. Jonah stood slowly, his hand resting on his gun. And I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. You've been running matrimonial cons through this territory for 6 years, 23 women that we know of. Maybe more. He took a step forward, including my sister, Emma Callahan, who answered your advertisement in 1872. For a moment, no one moved. Lydia stood frozen with the coat in her hands. Morrison had disappeared behind the bar. Davis emerged from the back room, gun drawn but pointed at the floor. Then Thomas smiled, a different smile, sharp and utterly devoid of warmth. Emma, pretty girl, Missouri accent, believed every word I wrote her. His eyes flicked to Lydia. Just like this one. Lydia felt the words land like blows, but she refused to flinch. Where is she? How should I know? Thomas shrugged, still smiling. She got what she paid for, a wedding ceremony, a night in Denver City, and a note explaining that the ranch had burned down. Last I saw her, she was crying in a hotel room. If she's too stupid to find her way home, that's not my problem. Jonah's face went white. You married her? I marry most of them. Thomas's tone was conversational, as if discussing the weather. It's cleaner that way. Harder for them to claim fraud when there's a marriage certificate. And by the time they realize the ranch doesn't exist, the preacher's moved on, the witnesses have forgotten, and I'm already working the next town under a different name. He looked at Lydia. You would have been number 24, sweetheart, but you had to go and get smart. No, Lydia said quietly. I got angry. There's a difference. Marshal Callahan, Davis spoke up from behind them. I think you've got enough for an arrest. More than enough. Jonah moved forward, pulling handcuffs from his belt. Thomas Whitmore, you're under arrest for fraud, theft, and obtaining money under false pretenses. You have the right to... Thomas moved fast, faster than Lydia would have thought possible. His hand shot out, grabbing her arm and yanking her forward. Something cold and sharp pressed against her throat. A knife, she realized with distant clarity, probably concealed in his sleeve the whole time. I don't think so, Thomas said, backing toward the door with Lydia held against his chest. I think I'm going to walk out of here. And you're going to let me, because if you don't, this girl's blood will be all over Morrison's floor. The pressure of the blade increased slightly, and Lydia felt a thin line of heat across her skin. Not deep, just a warning. Her hand moved to her pocket, fingers closing around the derringer. She'd have one chance. Maybe. Let her go, Jonah said, his voice deadly calm. Whatever you've done, killing her will make it murder. The territory hangs men for murder. They have to catch me first. Thomas had reached the door now, moonlight spilling across his shoulders. And I've been doing this for 6 years without getting caught. I'm not about to let one bitter rancher and his bait ruin that record. Your record's over, Davis said flatly. We've got warrants from 4 territories. We've got testimony from witnesses. Even if you kill her and run, we'll find you eventually. Eventually isn't today. Thomas's grip on Lydia tightened. Now here's what's going to happen. I'm going to walk backward to my horse with my lovely fiancée here as insurance. Once I'm mounted and clear of rifle range, I'll let her go. She can walk back and you can spend the next 6 years looking for me in the wrong places. Just like you've been doing. Lydia's fingers touched the derringer's grip. The cold metal felt solid, real, possible. She thought about Emma Callahan crying in a Denver hotel room. She thought about 22 other women abandoned and ashamed. She thought about every woman who'd ever believed a promise that turned out to be a lie. No more waiting, she whispered, so quietly only Thomas could hear. Then she dropped her weight suddenly, throwing Thomas off balance for just an instant. In that instant, she pulled the derringer from her pocket, twisted in his grip, and fired point-blank into his shoulder. The knife clattered to the floor. Thomas screamed, stumbling backward, clutching his bleeding shoulder. And Jonah was there, tackling him to the ground, wrestling his arms behind his back while Davis rushed forward with the handcuffs. Morrison appeared with a shotgun from behind the bar, looking disappointed he hadn't gotten to use it. And Lydia stood in the doorway, the derringer still smoking in her hand, her heart pounding so hard she could barely breathe, and felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Not hope, not victory. Something harder and truer. She'd stopped waiting. She'd saved herself. And tomorrow, Thomas Whitmore would face justice. Not for Emma Callahan alone, but for every woman he'd ever convinced that her worth depended on his false promises. The gunshot echoed through Morrison's station like a thunderclap, leaving behind a ringing silence broken only by Thomas Whitmore's labored breathing and the scrape of handcuffs clicking shut around his wrists. Lydia's hand trembled as she lowered the derringer, the acrid smell of gunpowder sharp in her nostrils. Miss Hartwell, Jonah's voice cut through the haze. He'd secured Thomas against the wall, blood seeping through the man's shirt where the bullet had torn through his shoulder. Are you hurt? Lydia touched her throat where the knife had pressed, her fingers coming away with a thin smear of blood. No, he didn't. It's just a scratch. Morrison, get some bandages, Davis ordered, keeping his gun trained on Thomas. For both of them. Thomas laughed, a bitter sound edged with pain. You want me to patch me up so you can hang me proper? How civilized. Nobody's hanging you yet, Jonah said coldly, pressing a folded cloth against the wound to slow the bleeding. Thomas hissed, but didn't pull away. First, you're going to answer questions, starting with where Emma ended up after Denver City. I told you, hotel room, crying. Thomas's face had gone pale, sweat beading on his forehead. That's the last I saw of any of them. I take what I need, and I leave. What happens after isn't my concern. The marriage certificate, Davis said. Where did you file it? Didn't. Paid some drunk in a rented collar to perform a ceremony that wasn't worth the paper it was written on. Certificate went in the fire soon as the girls stopped looking. Thomas met Jonah's eyes, and there was something almost like pity in his expression. Your sister's not married to anyone, Marshall. She's just another woman who trusted the wrong man. Jonah's jaw clenched so hard Lydia heard his teeth grind. For a moment she thought he might hit Thomas despite the man already being wounded and restrained. Instead, he stepped back, hands curling into fists at his sides. Get him to Doc Pritchard in Lodgepole, Jonah said to Davis, his voice carefully controlled. Make sure the shoulder's treated, then lock him in the territorial jail. I'll bring Miss Hartwell in tomorrow to give her statement. What about the money? Thomas asked, nodding toward the coat Lydia still held. You gonna count it? Make sure your bait wasn't lying about having $300? Lydia walked over to where Thomas sat slumped against the wall and looked down at him. In the lamplight, with blood soaking his shirt and handcuffs binding his wrists, he looked smaller somehow. Less dangerous. Just a man who'd built his life on exploiting desperate women now facing consequences he'd thought himself too clever to meet. There is no money, Lydia said quietly. The coat lining has newspaper clippings and old letters. The jewelry in the box belonged to my landlady in Philadelphia. She loaned it to me for the journey. I don't have $300. I don't have $30. Everything I owned of value went toward the train ticket west. She paused, letting him absorb this. You gambled on me being worth robbing, and you lost. Understanding dawned in Thomas's eyes, followed by something that might have been respect if it hadn't been mixed with such obvious fury. You set me up. We set you up, Jonah corrected. And you walked right into it because you couldn't imagine a woman being smart enough to fight back. Get him out of here, Davis said, hauling Thomas to his feet. The wounded man swayed but stayed upright, pride keeping him from showing more weakness than necessary. Come on, Whitmore. Let's get that shoulder looked at before you bleed all over Morrison's floor. They moved toward the door, Davis supporting most of Thomas's weight while keeping his gun ready. At the threshold, Thomas turned back one last time. You think this changes anything? He asked, looking at Lydia. You think catching me makes you any less alone? Any less desperate? I didn't create your circumstances, sweetheart. I just profited from them. His smile was thin and cruel. And there are 100 men like me out here, ready to do the same to the next woman foolish enough to believe in promises. Then Davis shoved him through the door and into the night, leaving Lydia standing in the middle of Morrison Station with those words echoing in her ears. Morrison emerged from behind the bar with whiskey and bandages. Miss Hartwell, let me see that cut. She sat obediently while he cleaned the thin line across her throat, barely more than a scratch, just as she'd said, but it stung as he applied salve and a small bandage. The whiskey he pressed into her hand burned going down, but it steadied the trembling that had started in her fingers and spread through her entire body. Jonah stood by the window, watching Davis and Thomas disappear down the dark road toward Lodgepole. His profile was harsh in the lamplight, all sharp angles and shadows, and Lydia realized she had no idea what he was thinking. Relief that Thomas was finally caught, frustration that the man still wouldn't give useful information about Emma, or something else entirely? Marshall Callahan, she said softly. Are you all right? He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face made her breath catch. Not anger, not satisfaction, just a bone-deep weariness that spoke of years spent chasing a ghost through endless frontier towns. I don't know, he admitted. 6 years I've been looking for him. 6 years of following rumors and checking matrimonial advertisements and arriving too late or finding nothing. And now I've got him in custody, and all I can think is that it doesn't change anything. Emma's still gone. Those other women are still abandoned. Nothing I did tonight brings any of them back. But it stops him from doing it again, Lydia pointed out. That has to count for something. Does it? Jonah crossed to the table and sat down heavily, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. There are 100 men like him, just like he said. Maybe more. The territory is full of predators who know that desperate women make easy targets. I caught one. So what? Morrison set another glass of whiskey in front of Jonah and retreated to give them privacy. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling the windows and carrying the smell of approaching rain. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Lydia studied Jonah Callahan in the lamplight. This man who'd spent 6 years of his life hunting justice for a sister who might not even be alive, who'd recruited a stranger to act as bait, who'd promised to keep her safe and had kept that promise despite Thomas's knife at her throat. She thought about what Thomas had said, about circumstances and desperation and foolish belief in promises. "You're right," she said finally. "There are 100 men like Thomas Whitmore, maybe more, and the territory is full of women desperate enough to believe their lies." She met Jonah's eyes across the table. "But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. It means we fight smarter." "How?" The question wasn't rhetorical. Jonah leaned forward, genuinely wanting an answer. "How do you fight against men who prey on the fact that women have nowhere else to turn?" "You give them somewhere to turn." The idea had been forming in Lydia's mind since the moment Thomas had called her bait, since the moment she'd realized how many women had fallen for the same lies. Not promises, not rescue, just resources, information, a place where women can check whether matrimonial advertisements are legitimate before they spend their last dollar on a train ticket west. Jonah's expression shifted, skepticism giving way to something that might have been hope. "You're talking about a registry, some kind of warning system." "More than that." Lydia's thoughts raced ahead, building structure around the raw idea. A place where women can stay if they arrive and find out they've been deceived. Where they can work for wages while they decide their next move. Where they can learn which ranchers are actually looking for wives and which ones are running cons. She paused, testing the weight of what she was proposing. A way station, for women who need time to stop waiting and start choosing. "That would take money," Jonah said slowly. "Property. Resources most women don't have access to." "Most women don't." Lydia thought about her empty reticule, her borrowed jewelry, her non-existent $300. "But some do. Some have family money or inheritances or businesses. Some would be willing to invest in something that might have saved them from making the same mistakes." She leaned forward, warming to the idea. "And some men might be willing to help. Men like you who understand that catching one predator isn't enough if the circumstances that create victims never change." Jonah was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands wrapped around the whiskey glass, his eyes distant with thought. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a determination that hadn't been there before. "I have land," he said. 20 miles north of here, good grazing, decent water, house that's too big for one person. Been thinking about selling it, actually. Can't seem to make myself care about cattle when Emma's still out there somewhere." He looked up at Lydia. "What if instead of selling, I put it towards something that might actually matter? Something that might stop other sisters from disappearing?" "You do that?" Lydia's heart kicked against her ribs. "You don't even know me. You don't know if I'm capable of running something like that." "You shot a man who had a knife to your throat," Jonah pointed out. "Seems to me you're capable of quite a bit when circumstances require it." His mouth quirked in something almost like a smile. "Besides, I saw how you handled yourself tonight. Cool under pressure, smart enough to play the role Thomas expected while planning 3 moves ahead. Those are exactly the qualities women in desperate circumstances need to learn." Morrison appeared at their table with a pot of coffee and 3 cups. "Mind if I contribute to this conversation?" He poured without waiting for permission. "I've been running this stage stop for 12 years. You know how many women I've seen stranded here waiting for men who never come? How many times I've had to turn them out because they couldn't pay for another night's lodging and I couldn't afford charity?" He shook his head. "Whatever you're planning, count me in. I'll help spread word at the stage stops, warn women about known cons, direct them north if they need refuge." "We'd need more than land and information," Lydia said, her practical side asserting itself even as hope began to bloom. "We'd need funding for supplies, a way for women to earn money, sewing perhaps, or laundry. We'd need legal protection, something to prevent men from claiming we're harboring their property if they've managed to trick women into marriage." "I know a lawyer in Cheyenne," Shipol, Jonah offered. "Abigail Marsh, one of the few women practicing law in the territory. She specializes in cases involving fraud and matrimonial disputes. She'd know how to structure this legally. And I know women, Morrison added. Shopkeepers' wives, teachers, boarding house owners, women who've built lives out here despite everything trying to stop them. Some of them would help. Some would contribute money or time or connections. Lydia sat back, overwhelmed by how quickly an idea born of anger and desperation was taking shape into something possible, something real. She thought about the finishing school in Philadelphia, where she'd taught deportment to girls who'd never need to support themselves, and compared it to this, a place where women would learn survival, self-reliance, how to recognize lies, and demand better. It can't just be charity, she said firmly. Women who come there need to contribute something, work, information, whatever they have to offer. Otherwise, we're just creating a different kind of dependence. Agreed, Jonah said. This isn't about rescue. It's about giving women time and space to make their own choices. And it can't be secret, Lydia continued, ideas crystallizing. It needs to be public knowledge, advertised in the same newspapers that run matrimonial notices, so women know before they travel west that there's an alternative if their prospects don't work out. The Hartwell station, Morrison suggested, has a nice ring to it. Absolutely not, Lydia shook her head. I won't have my name on something that might fail, or worse, that might succeed but get destroyed by the first man who decides we're interfering with his God-given right to exploit desperate women. She thought for a moment. The crossroads. Simple. Accurate. A place where women can choose which direction to go. Jonah raised his coffee cup. To the crossroads, then, and to women who refuse to keep waiting. Lydia touched her cup to his, the gesture feeling ceremonial despite the rough surroundings and the late hour. Outside, the rain finally arrived, drumming on the roof like applause. They talked until dawn, planning details and identifying obstacles. Morrison contributed a century's worth of practical knowledge about frontier survival. Jonah provided legal insight and connections to territorial authorities who might support the venture. And Lydia, drawing on years of teaching and observation, sketched out a curriculum of sorts. Not deportment and needlework, but budgeting and contract reading, self-defense and land law, how to spot a con man and how to negotiate fair wages. By the time the morning stage rolled in, they had the bones of a plan. It would take months to implement, maybe years before it truly functioned. But it was something, a direction, a purpose that extended beyond simple survival. I should get back to the ranch, Jonah said as pale light filtered through the windows. Check on things before heading into Lodgepole. You'll need to come give your statement to the territorial prosecutor, probably this afternoon, if you're up for it. I'll be ready. Lydia stood, feeling the night's events settle into her bones, exhaustion and adrenaline fading, leaving behind a strange sort of clarity. Marshal Callahan, Jonah, thank you for believing Thomas was worth catching, for giving me a chance to fight back instead of just accepting what happened to me. You did the fighting, Jonah said, settling his hat on his head. I just provided the opportunity. He paused at the door, looking back. When you give your statement today, they're going to ask detailed questions. About the letters he sent, the promises he made, how you felt when he didn't show up. It won't be pleasant. I know. Lydia had been dreading that conversation since the moment Davis had led Thomas away. But it needs to be done. For Emma and all the others. For Emma and all the others, Jonah agreed softly. Then he was gone, riding north into the rainy morning, leaving Lydia alone with Morrison and her thoughts. She spent the morning resting, her body demanding sleep, even as her mind kept replaying the previous night's events, the weight of the derringer in her pocket, the moment Thomas's mask had fallen away, the look in Jonah's eyes when Thomas had mentioned Emma crying in a hotel room, the sharp clarity that had come with pulling the trigger, the understanding that she'd crossed some invisible line between victim and survivor. After noon, Morrison loaned her his wagon and drove her into Lodgepole, a rough collection of buildings huddled around a muddy main street, the kind of town that existed primarily to service ranches and mining camps scattered through the surrounding territory. The territorial jail occupied a stone building at the north end of town, substantial enough to suggest this was where prisoners waited for circuit judges who might not arrive for months. Marshal Davis met them at the door, looking tired but satisfied. Miss Hartwell, Jonas said you'd be coming. Prosecutor's waiting inside. She'll want a full account of everything that happened. She? Lydia felt a small spark of relief. Somehow telling this story to another woman seemed marginally less humiliating than recounting her gullibility to a man. Margaret Fletcher, smart as they come and mean as a snake when she's got a guilty man in her sights. Davis held the door open. Thomas Whitmore's shoulder is bandaged and he's locked up tight. Doc says the wound's clean, no permanent damage. He'll live to stand trial. The prosecutor's office was a cramped room dominated by a desk covered in legal documents and law books. Behind it sat a woman perhaps 10 years older than Lydia, with steel gray hair pinned in a severe bun and eyes that assessed everything with lawyerly precision. She stood as Lydia entered, extending a hand across the desk. "Miss Hartwell, I'm Margaret Fletcher, territorial prosecutor. Please, sit." Her handshake was firm, businesslike. "I understand you had quite an evening. Would you like coffee before we begin?" "No, thank you." Lydia settled into the wooden chair across from the desk, folding her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "I'd prefer to just get through this, if that's all right." "Of course." Margaret pulled out a clean sheet of paper and dipped her pen in ink. "I need you to start from the beginning. How did you first encounter the man calling himself Thomas Whitmore?" So Lydia told it. All of it. The advertisement in the Matrimonial Times, her circumstances in Philadelphia after her father's death, the decision to answer, driven by desperation and dwindling options. The letters Thomas had sent, eloquent, respectful, full of promises about partnership and building a life together. The train journey west with her small savings and borrowed jewelry. The arrival at Morrison Station 3 days ago, expecting to be met by her fiancé. The waiting. The growing certainty that something was wrong. And then Jonah Callahan arriving with the truth about Thomas Whitmore and a plan to catch him. Margaret's pen scratched steadily across the paper, recording every detail. She asked clarifying questions occasionally, dates, specific phrasing from letters, the exact sequence of events during Thomas's arrest. Her expression remained neutral throughout, but Lydia caught glimpses of anger tightening around her mouth when she described Thomas's cruelty, his casual dismissal of the women he'd harmed. "And when he put the knife to your throat," Margaret said, "you discharged a firearm Marshal Callahan had given you for self-defense. Can you describe your thought process in that moment?" Lydia remembered the cold pressure of the blade, the certainty that Thomas would kill her rather than face arrest, the weight of the derringer in her pocket. "I wasn't thinking," she admitted. "I was acting. He was going to take me hostage, or worse. I had a weapon. I used it." "Were you in fear for your life?" "Yes." "Did Marshal Callahan order you to shoot?" "No. He told me to carry the derringer in case of emergency, but the decision to fire was entirely mine." Margaret made a note, then looked up with something that might have been approval. "Good. That will make the self-defense claim unambiguous." She set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. "Miss Hartwell, you should know that Thomas Whitmore, whose real name appears to be David St. Clair, according to records we've obtained from Colorado, has been wanted in 4 territories for matrimonial fraud. Your case will be the foundation of the prosecution, but we have 6 other women willing to testify about similar experiences. Together, you can ensure he spends considerable time in territorial prison." 6 others? Lydia felt relief war with anger. Relief that she wasn't alone. Anger that 6 women had suffered and she was only the latest. Out of 23 that Marshal Callahan mentioned? "Most won't testify." Margaret's voice went soft with regret. "They're ashamed. Afraid their families will find out. Worried about being associated with scandal. Or they've moved on with their lives and don't want to revisit the trauma." She paused. "The fact that you're willing to go on record, to have your name attached to this prosecution, it matters, Miss Hartwell. It gives other women courage to come forward." "What about Emma Callahan?" Lydia asked. "Marshal Callahan's sister. Is there any evidence she's one of the victims?" Margaret's expression darkened. "We're still investigating. Thomas claims he left her in Denver City 6 years ago, but there's no record of a marriage certificate, no record of her leaving the city afterward. She essentially vanished." She tapped her pen against the desk, thinking. "The problem is that without a body or concrete evidence of harm, we can't charge him with anything related to Emma specifically. The fraud charges are solid, but if something worse happened to her, we may never be able to prove it." Lydia thought about Jonah's face when Thomas had dismissed Emma so casually about 6 years of searching and hoping and fearing the worst. He knows what happened to her. I'm certain of it. He was too specific about the hotel room, too confident that she wouldn't be found. I believe you're right, Margaret said, but belief isn't evidence, and Thomas St. Clair is smart enough to know the difference. He'll serve time for fraud, possibly 5 to 10 years if I can convince the judge of the scope of his crimes. But whatever he did to Emma Callahan, we may never have justice for that particular crime. The unfairness of it settled over Lydia like a weight. Thomas had stolen from at least 23 women, had possibly killed one, and would still walk free eventually. Yes, he'd be imprisoned. Yes, his ability to continue his cons would be curtailed. But the damage he'd done would echo through those women's lives for years, while he served his sentence and returned to the world with his charm intact and new schemes already forming. It's not enough, Lydia said quietly. No, Margaret agreed, it never is. But it's what we have. The law is a blunt instrument, Miss Hartwell. It punishes crimes we can prove, not the suffering we know exists but can't document. She stood, signaling the interview was finished. You'll need to stay in the territory until the trial, which won't be scheduled until the circuit judge arrives. Probably 2 months, possibly 3. Do you have somewhere to stay? Marshal Callahan has offered me work at his ranch, Lydia said, the plan forming even as she spoke. And we're discussing a larger project, a place where women in situations like mine can find temporary refuge while they make decisions about their futures. Margaret's eyebrows rose. The crossroads. Jonah mentioned something about that this morning. You're serious about actually doing this? Completely serious. Lydia met the prosecutor's eyes. Thomas was right about one thing. There are men like him all over this territory preying on desperate women. Catching one doesn't change the circumstances that make women vulnerable, but creating alternatives might. Then you'll need legal counsel, Margaret said briskly. I know Abigail Marsh in Cheyenne. She handles matrimonial law and property rights. I'll write to her on your behalf, explain what you're planning. She'll make sure you structure it in a way that protects both you and the women you're trying to help. Marshal Callahan mentioned her name, Lydia said, surprised at how quickly pieces were falling into place. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Margaret walked her to the door, her expression serious. What you're proposing will make enemies, Miss Hartwell. Men who profit from women's desperation won't appreciate you giving those women options. You'll be called a troublemaker, a radical, possibly worse. Are you prepared for that? Lydia thought about the past 3 days. The humiliation of being abandoned. The moment she'd decided to fight back instead of accepting defeat. The cold clarity that had come with pulling the trigger on Thomas Whitmore's shoulder. The conversation with Jonah and Morrison that had stretched through the night, building something new from the wreckage of her broken expectations. I'm prepared, she said. I've already lost my reputation, my savings, and my faith in promises. There's not much left to take from me except my resolve, and that's the one thing I won't give up. Margaret smiled, and it transformed her stern face into something warm and almost conspiratorial. Then I think you'll do just fine out here, Miss Hartwell. The frontier has a way of breaking women who can't adapt. But for those who can, for those who refuse to break, it offers possibilities that don't exist anywhere else. Lydia left the prosecutor's office with her statement recorded and her role in the trial secured. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the street mud-slicked and gleaming. Morrison waited with the wagon, and beside him Jonah Callahan sat his horse, clearly having finished his own business in town. All done? Jonah asked as she climbed into the wagon. For now. Lydia settled onto the bench beside Morrison. The prosecutor says the trial won't be for another 2 or 3 months. That gives us time then. Jonah guided his horse alongside the wagon as Morrison started back toward the station. Time to get the crossroads operational before winter makes everything harder. Time to spread word through the stage stops and territorial newspapers. Time to find women willing to help run the place once it's established. You're sure about this? Lydia asked. About using your land, your resources, for women you don't know and might never meet? Jonah was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the mountains rising blue and distant beyond the town. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 6 years' worth of regret and determination. Emma's gone, he said. I've accepted that, even if I never learn exactly what happened to her. But her disappearance doesn't have to be meaningless. If we can build something that prevents other women from vanishing the same way, if we can give them resources to fight back before they're stranded and desperate, then maybe Emma's loss becomes something other than just tragedy. Purpose, Lydia said softly, understanding. You're giving her disappearance purpose. I'm trying to. Jonah looked at her, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw past the careful control to the grief underneath. Is that wrong? Using her memory as justification for something she never chose? No, Lydia said. It's not wrong. It's what we do with loss. We transform it into something that means the suffering wasn't pointless. She thought about her own losses, her father's death, and her brother's dismissal and the humiliation of answering Thomas Whitmore's advertisement. We make it matter. They rode in silence back to Morrison Station as the sun broke through the clouds, turning the wet prairie grass silver and gold. And Lydia Hartwell, who'd come west expecting marriage and found betrayal instead, felt the first stirrings of something she'd thought she'd lost forever. Not hope. Hope was still too fragile, too easily broken. This was something harder. This was determination born of anger and refined by purpose. This was the knowledge that waiting for rescue had nearly destroyed her, and choosing to fight back had saved her. Thomas Whitmore had been right about one thing. She was alone and desperate, with circumstances that had made her vulnerable. But he'd been wrong about what that meant. Alone didn't mean helpless. Desperate didn't mean defeated. And vulnerable didn't mean victim. It just meant she'd had to learn the hard way that the only person who could save her was herself. And once that lesson was learned, everything else became possible. The Callahan Ranch sat in a valley where the prairie grass gave way to pine-covered hills protected from the worst of the wind by ridges that rose like sentinels on three sides. The house was larger than Lydia had expected. 2 stories of weathered timber with a wide porch that wrapped around the front, built by someone who'd planned for a family that had never materialized. Outbuildings dotted the property, a barn and stable, a bunkhouse that currently stood empty, corrals where cattle grazed in the distance. It's more than I need, Jonah said as he helped Lydia down from Morrison's wagon. They'd stopped at the station long enough for her to collect her carpet bag, and for Morrison to extract promises that they'd keep him informed of progress. Built it 10 years ago when I thought I'd marry, have children, build something that would last beyond my own lifetime. But Emma's disappearance put an end to those plans. Hard to think about starting a family when you can't protect the family you already have. The bitterness in his voice was old, worn smooth by years of repetition. Lydia understood it. Guilt was like that. It didn't fade so much as it became part of your foundation, something you built around rather than overcame. Show me what you're thinking, she said, keeping her tone practical. For the crossroads. Which buildings would work? What would need to be built? How many women could be housed here? Jonah led her through the property, pointing out possibilities. The bunkhouse could sleep 8 comfortably, 10 if necessary. The barn had space for additional beds in the loft if they needed overflow capacity. The main house had 4 bedrooms upstairs and a large kitchen built to feed ranch hands during roundup. Water came from a good well and a creek that ran year-round. The land could support a substantial garden, chickens, maybe pigs for meat. You'd need to stay in the main house, Jonah said as they stood on the porch, looking out over the valley. At least initially, until we can hire additional staff. It wouldn't be proper otherwise, women staying on a ranch with only a single man in residence. Proper, Lydia almost laughed. I think we're well past worrying about proper, Marshal Callahan. I'm a woman who shot a man last night and is now planning to run a refuge for other women society has written off as improper. Propriety is the least of my concerns. Maybe so. Jonah leaned against the porch rail, his expression thoughtful. But the women who come here will be vulnerable to enough criticism without us adding fuel to the fire. We do this right. Above board, respectable, with legal protections in place. Or we don't do it at all. The moment someone can credibly claim we're running a brothel or a haven for loose women, we lose any ability to help anyone. He was right, and Lydia knew it. The frontier might offer more freedom than Philadelphia in some ways, but reputation still mattered, especially for women trying to rebuild their lives. They'd need to be beyond reproach, which meant chaperones and careful documentation and constant vigilance against even the appearance of impropriety. Then we'll need a married couple to live on site, Lydia said, thinking through logistics. Someone respectable to provide oversight. And we'll need clear rules about what kind of help we can provide and what we can't. No harboring actual criminals. No protecting women from legitimate legal obligations. Just honest refuge for women who've been deceived or abandoned, and resources to help them make informed decisions about their futures. I might know someone. Jonah straightened, an idea clearly forming. Ben and Sarah Tucker. They've been working a hard-scrabble ranch 15 miles east, barely making ends meet. Ben's honest, good with livestock and carpentry. Sarah was a teacher before she married, knows her letters and numbers. They've got 3 children who could help with chores. If we offered them steady wages and housing in the main house, they might be willing to relocate. That would work. Lydia felt pieces clicking into place. Sarah could teach basic literacy and arithmetic to women who need it. Ben could maintain the property and provide a male presence for propriety's sake. The children would make the place feel less institutional, more like a real home. They spent the rest of that afternoon walking the property, making plans and solving problems. By evening, when Jonah rode back toward Morrison's station to make arrangements, Lydia stood alone on the porch and tried to envision what this place might become. Not just buildings and resources, but a community. A place where women who'd been made invisible by circumstance could become visible again, could choose their own paths rather than accepting whatever scraps society offered. The next week passed in a blur of activity. Jonah convinced the Tuckers to relocate, and they arrived 3 days later with a wagon full of possessions and children who immediately claimed the ranch as their own territory. Sarah Tucker proved to be a godsend, practical, unflappable, with the kind of organizational skills that came from managing a household on minimal resources. She took one look at the bunkhouse and started making lists of what was needed: beds, linens, a proper stove, storage for women's belongings, a space for laundry and mending. "We'll need rules," Sarah said, sitting at the kitchen table with Lydia, while Ben repaired loose boards on the bunkhouse porch. "Clear expectations for women who stay here. Work requirements, behavior standards, consequences for violations." "Not too restrictive," Lydia cautioned. "These women are coming from situations where men controlled every aspect of their lives. We don't want to just replace one form of control with another." "Agreed." Sarah tapped her pencil against the paper where she'd been drafting guidelines. "But structure provides safety, especially for women who've had their trust violated. They need to know what's expected, what they'll receive in return, how long they can stay. Otherwise, it becomes chaotic, and chaos breeds resentment." They worked together to create a framework that balanced freedom with accountability. Women could stay at the crossroads for up to 3 months while they decided their next steps. In exchange, they'd contribute 4 hours of daily labor: cooking, cleaning, laundry, garden work, whatever was needed to keep the place functioning. They'd attend evening classes where Sarah would teach literacy and numeracy, where Lydia would cover practical frontier skills like contract reading and recognizing common frauds. And they'd participate in a registry project that Jonah was coordinating with Morrison and other stage stop operators, documenting matrimonial advertisements, tracking patterns of fraud, building a network of information that could warn other women before they made irreversible decisions. "What about women who want to stay longer?" Sarah asked. 3 months might not be enough for someone with nowhere else to go." "Then we help them find employment or housing elsewhere," Lydia said. "This can't be permanent refuge. We don't have the resources for that. It has to be transitional, a bridge between crisis and stability." Morrison arrived 2 weeks after the planning began, bringing news that spread like wildfire through their small group. 6 more women, he announced, climbing down from his wagon with the kind of satisfaction that came from delivering important information. 6 women read about Thomas Whitmore's arrest in the territorial newspaper. They're willing to testify against him. Margaret Fletcher sent word that the prosecution is stronger than she'd hoped. 6 more. Lydia felt the numbers settle into her chest like stones. 6 women he convinced to trust him. 6 lives disrupted by his lies. "And 6 women brave enough to stand up in court and say so," Morrison countered. "That's not nothing, Miss Hartwell. That's justice starting to work the way it's supposed to." The trial was scheduled for late September, when the circuit judge would arrive in Lodgepole for his quarterly session. That gave them 6 weeks to prepare the crossroads for its first residents, because several of the women testifying had nowhere else to stay while waiting for the court date. Margaret Fletcher had suggested they might benefit from the kind of support the Crossroads was designed to provide. "It's too soon," Sarah protested when Lydia raised the possibility. "We're not ready. The bunkhouse still needs—" "The bunkhouse has beds and a stove and a roof that doesn't leak," Lydia interrupted gently. "Everything else is luxury. These women don't need luxury. They need safety and time to breathe." So in mid-August, the first residents arrived. 3 women, traveling together from Denver City, where Margaret had gathered them for depositions. Clara Brennan, 34, widowed and convinced by Thomas, using the name Robert Fletcher, to invest her small inheritance in a ranch that didn't exist. Beth Morrison, no relation to the stage stop operator, barely 20 years old, who'd left Kentucky believing she was marrying a prosperous cattle broker. And Harriet Chen, daughter of a Chinese merchant and an Irish mother, who'd responded to an advertisement promising acceptance and partnership in a territory where mixed-race marriages were legal. They arrived exhausted, wary, carrying everything they owned in battered trunks and carpet bags. Lydia met them on the porch, remembering her own arrival at Morrison Station just weeks ago, the weight of disappointment and shame that had made it hard to breathe. "Welcome to the Crossroads," she said simply. "You're safe here. No one will judge you. No one will force you to leave before you're ready, and no one will make promises they can't keep. What we offer is time, resources, and honest information. What we ask in return is that you contribute what you can and help us build something that might prevent other women from needing what we're trying to provide." Clara, the oldest, studied Lydia with sharp eyes that had learned not to trust easily. "And what happens when the trial's over, when we've testified and Thomas Whitmore's in prison? Where do we go then?" "Wherever you choose," Lydia said. "East, if you have family willing to take you back. West, if you want to try the frontier on your own terms. Or you stay in the territory and build something new. The choice is yours. That's the whole point of this place, giving you time to make choices instead of just accepting whatever circumstances offer." Beth, the youngest, looked like she might cry. "No one's given me a choice about anything since I left Kentucky. My father chose my apprenticeship. Thomas chose my travel dates. The territorial marshal chose when I'd give my deposition. I've been a pawn in other people's decisions for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to choose anything for myself." "Then you'll learn here," Sarah said, emerging from the house with fresh bread and butter. "Starting with supper. We're having stew or chicken or both if you're hungry enough. Your choice." It was such a small thing, choosing between stew and chicken. But watching Beth's face as she carefully considered the options, as she said, "Stew, please," with the solemnity of someone making a momentous decision, Lydia understood what they were really building here. Not just refuge, not just information and resources, but the fundamental restoration of agency to women who'd had it systematically stripped away by circumstances and predators and a society that treated their desperation as weakness to be exploited. The first weeks with residents were chaotic. Clara proved to be an exceptional cook, but refused to follow Sarah's organizational systems. Beth was eager to help, but burst into tears whenever anyone spoke sharply. Harriet kept to herself, spending hours in the garden or with the livestock, clearly more comfortable with plants and animals than people. The Tucker children regarded the newcomers with frank curiosity that their mother had to constantly moderate. But slowly, carefully, a rhythm emerged. Morning chores followed by breakfast. Midday work on whatever the ranch or household needed. Afternoon lessons where Sarah taught reading to Beth, who'd had minimal schooling, and where Lydia ran through practical frontier skills with all 3 women. Evening meals eaten together around the big kitchen table, conversations gradually becoming less guarded as trust built incrementally. Jonah visited twice weekly, always with news about the trial preparation or leads on women who might need the Crossroads services. He was careful to maintain proper distance, never staying overnight, never being alone with any of the women without Sarah or Ben present, conscious that his reputation was tied to the project's credibility. But Lydia noticed how he looked at what they were building, the satisfaction in his eyes when Clara laughed at something Ben said, or when Beth proudly read aloud from the territorial newspaper, or when Harriet emerged from her silence long enough to suggest improvements to the garden layout. "It's working," he said one evening, standing on the porch with Lydia after supper while the others cleaned up inside. "I didn't think it would, not really. Thought maybe we were being naive, thinking 3 women in a plan could change anything substantial. It's 3 women now, Lydia pointed out. But Morrison's already sent word about 2 more who need temporary housing. And Margaret Fletcher mentioned a woman in Cheyenne who's trying to leave her husband but has no resources. The need isn't going to diminish, Jonah. It's going to grow. I know. He leaned against the porch rail, silhouetted against the sunset. Which means we need to think bigger, more funding, more housing. A way to make this sustainable beyond just my land and your determination. I've been thinking about that. Lydia had spent several sleepless nights working through possibilities. What if we charged a small fee? Not to women who stay here. They contribute through labor, that's enough. But to ranchers and businessmen who are actually looking for wives or employees, we could offer a verification service. They pay us to confirm they're legitimate, we investigate their claims and provide references to women considering their proposals. Honest men should be willing to pay for the credibility, and the fee would fund operations here. Jonah turned to look at her, surprise and respect mixing in his expression. That's smart, really smart. It turns the matrimonial system into something transparent instead of exploitative. It also creates incentive for men to be honest, Lydia continued, warming to the idea as she articulated it. Right now, there's no penalty for lying in advertisements. Worst case, the woman doesn't show up or leaves quickly. But if we build a reputation for thorough verification, men who refuse to participate will raise red flags. Women will know to be suspicious of anyone who won't submit to our process. We'd need investigators, Jonah said thoughtfully. People to check land claims, talk to neighbors, verify financial situations. And we'd need legal protection so men can't sue us for damaging their reputations if we uncover fraud. Margaret Fletcher, Lydia said immediately, and Abigail Marsh in Cheyenne. Between them, they should be able to structure this legally. And for investigators, what about former lawmen? Men like you, who know how to follow evidence and recognize lies. Maybe. Jonah's hand drifted unconsciously to his badge. I've been thinking about stepping back from active duty. 6 years of chasing Thomas Whitmore taught me that catching individual criminals doesn't solve systemic problems. But this, building structures that prevent crime before it happens, that might actually make a difference. Before Lydia could respond, the kitchen door banged open and Clara appeared, flour dusting her apron and irritation written across her face. Miss Hartwell, you need to settle an argument. Beth insists we should make apple pie tomorrow when half our apples aren't ripe yet. I say we wait another week, but she's being stubborn about it. Lydia bit back a smile. A month ago, Clara wouldn't have asked anyone's opinion. She'd have simply done what she thought best and bristled at contradiction. Beth wouldn't have argued at all. She'd have deferred immediately to whatever the older woman wanted. The fact that they were arguing about pie while appealing to outside arbitration was actually progress. Check the apples tomorrow morning, Lydia suggested. If enough are ripe, we make pie. If not, we wait. That way you're both right. We make pie when we can, but only with fruit that's ready. Clara harumphed but nodded, disappearing back inside. Through the window, Lydia could see Beth grinning like she'd won something important, which perhaps she had. The right to express an opinion and have it considered was its own small victory. You're good at this, Jonah observed quietly, managing different personalities, finding compromises that let everyone keep their dignity. It's not easy work. It's exhausting work, Lydia admitted. Some days I wonder what I'm doing, whether I'm equipped to run something like this. I have no training in administration or psychology or law. I'm just a former finishing school teacher who got lucky enough to avoid a con man's worst intentions. You're more than that. Jonah's voice carried conviction that made Lydia turn to look at him fully. You're someone who saw a problem and decided to solve it instead of just surviving it. That takes vision most people don't have. The sincerity in his expression made Lydia's throat tighten. She'd spent so long being invisible, first in her brother's house, then at the finishing school, then in her correspondence with Thomas Whitmore, that being truly seen felt almost dangerous, like if she accepted the acknowledgement, she'd somehow be responsible for living up to it permanently. I should check on supper cleanup, she said, deflecting. Sarah's been doing too much. I need to make sure the others are pulling their weight. She escaped inside before Jonah could say anything else, but his words followed her through the evening chores and into the night. You're someone who saw a problem and decided to solve it. Was that what she was doing? Or was she just running from the shame of her own near disaster, trying to transform personal humiliation into something that looked like purpose? The question haunted her through the following weeks as the crossroads began to take shape as something more than just an idea. Morrison sent 2 more women, both abandoned at stage stops by men who'd promised marriage. Margaret Fletcher forwarded information about a network of women's groups in the East who might be willing to fund their verification service. Abigail Marsh visited from Cheyenne, spending 3 days working through legal structures and protections, and left with documents that would establish the crossroads as a legitimate territorial business with clear liability limitations. "You're building something unprecedented," Abigail said before she left, her sharp eyes assessing Lydia like she was a witness being prepared for cross-examination. "Most women's aid organizations back east focus on moral reform, teaching fallen women to be respectable. You're doing something different. You're treating these women like they're rational adults capable of making their own decisions if given adequate information. That's radical, Miss Hartwell. Be prepared for resistance." The resistance came sooner than expected. A rancher named Jack Morrison, no relation to the stage stop operator, though he made sure everyone knew he found the shared name embarrassing, rode onto the property 2 days before the trial was set to begin. He was a large man, prosperous-looking, with the kind of confidence that came from never being told no. "I'm looking for my wife," he announced without preamble, not bothering to dismount. "Beth Morrison. I heard she's staying here." Lydia, who'd been working in the garden with Harriet, straightened slowly, wiping dirt from her hands. "And you are?" "Jack Morrison, Beth's husband. We married 3 weeks ago, legal and proper, but she ran off before we could even get to the ranch. I've come to collect what's mine." Beth's husband. Lydia felt her stomach clench. Beth had never mentioned a marriage, had consistently referred to Thomas Whitmore as her intended, not her husband. But if Jack Morrison was telling the truth, if Thomas had actually performed a legal ceremony, everything became more complicated. "Beth is a guest here," Lydia said carefully, very aware that Harriet was watching with wide eyes. "If you have a legal claim to her presence, you'll need to present documentation to our attorney." "I don't need documentation to collect my own wife." Jack's voice went hard. "She's coming with me now." "No, she's not." Ben Tucker emerged from the barn, shotgun held loosely but unmistakably ready. "This is private property, Morrison. You weren't invited and you're not taking anyone anywhere without proper legal process." For a moment, Lydia thought Jack might charge the smaller man, force a confrontation that would end badly for everyone. But then Jonah's voice cut through the tension. "Marshal Callahan, I suggest you leave, Morrison. This isn't a fight you're going to win." Jonah had appeared from the direction of the house, his badge visible and his hand resting on his gun. The sight of legal authority seemed to deflate Jack's aggression, though his expression remained ugly. "She's my wife," he repeated, but with less certainty. "I paid that preacher good money for the ceremony." "Then you should have no trouble providing the marriage certificate," Jonah said evenly. "Bring it to the territorial court in Lodgepole. If it's legitimate, we'll discuss next steps through proper legal channels. But you're not taking any woman from this property without her consent in a court order. Are we clear?" Jack spat in the dirt, a gesture of contempt that spoke volumes about what he thought of Jonah's authority. But he wheeled his horse around and rode off without further argument, leaving dust and unease in his wake. Beth appeared in the doorway of the bunkhouse, her face pale. "He's not my husband. He can't be. Thomas said the ceremony wasn't legal because the preacher wasn't ordained. He said we'd have a real wedding once we reached the ranch." "Tell me exactly what happened," Lydia said, guiding Beth to the porch steps. "Everything, from the moment you met Thomas to the moment you arrived here." The story that emerged was both familiar and horrifying. Beth had corresponded with Thomas, using the name William Garrett, for 4 months. He'd met her in Denver City, charming and attentive, and suggested they marry immediately rather than waiting to reach the ranch. The ceremony had been performed by a man in clerical garb in a boarding house parlor. Thomas had promised a proper church wedding later, then explained 2 days later that the ranch had been lost to a fire, the marriage wasn't legal anyway, and Beth should probably return home to Kentucky. He'd disappeared with the money she'd brought for her trousseau before she could fully process what had happened. "I thought he was being kind," Beth whispered, tears streaming down her face. Telling me the marriage wasn't legal, so I wouldn't be tied to a man who couldn't provide for me. I thought he was setting me free. He was covering his tracks, Jonah said grimly, making sure you couldn't claim marriage rights to his property or income. But if Jack Morrison has a legitimate marriage certificate with your name on it, if Thomas sold that certificate or used it to extract money from Morrison, we have a much bigger problem. Lydia's mind raced through implications. If Beth was legally married to Jack Morrison based on a fraudulent ceremony, she'd need an annulment or divorce to be free. That required money, legal representation, and time. If she refused to go with Morrison and he had a legitimate marriage certificate, he could claim she was a runaway wife and potentially have the law on his side. And if the Crossroads harbored a woman who was legally another man's property, because that's what wives still were in many jurisdictions, the entire project could be shut down for facilitating kidnapping or theft. We need Margaret Fletcher, Lydia said decisively. And Abigail Marsh if we can get her back here. This is exactly the kind of legal tangle they warned us about. The trial started the next day with Thomas Whitmore looking considerably less charming than he had at Morrison Station. 2 months in territorial jail had worn away his polish, leaving behind a thin, hard-faced man who watched the proceedings with the cold assessment of someone calculating odds. His attorney, a weary public defender who clearly didn't believe in his client's innocence, went through the motions of mounting a defense while Margaret Fletcher systematically destroyed every claim Thomas made. 7 women testified, including Lydia. Each told essentially the same story, elegant letters promising partnership and respect, requests that they bring whatever money they could for starting their new life together. Arrivals met with excuses or abandonment. The pattern was undeniable. The evidence was overwhelming. Even the judge, a stern man who'd seen decades of frontier crime, looked disgusted by the time the prosecution rested. But it was Beth's testimony that broke something open in the courtroom. When Margaret asked her to describe the marriage ceremony, Beth's voice shook but held steady. And when Thomas's attorney tried to discredit her by suggesting she'd participated willingly in a scheme to defraud Jack Morrison, she straightened in the witness chair and looked directly at Thomas. "You told me you loved me," Beth said quietly. "You said I was brave for coming west alone. You said we'd build a life together where my mixed heritage wouldn't matter because the frontier judged people by their actions, not their ancestry. You made me believe I could be someone other than the half-breed girl my father's family was embarrassed by." She paused, tears sliding down her cheeks. "You didn't just take my money, Mr. Whitmore. You took my hope, and then you tried to sell me to a man I'd never met, using a marriage ceremony you claimed wasn't legal. That's not fraud. That's cruelty." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the spectators who'd come for entertainment rather than justice seemed affected by the raw honesty in Beth's voice. Thomas stared at her with something that might have been surprise, as if he'd never considered that the women he conned were actual people with actual feelings, not just marks to be exploited. The jury deliberated for less than an hour, guilty on all counts of fraud and obtaining money under false pretenses. 15 years in territorial prison with credit for time served. The judge's final words echoed through the room like a benediction. "Mr. Whitmore, you have systematically exploited the vulnerability of women seeking honest partnership in the hardest circumstances this territory offers. You have turned their hope into profit and their trust into suffering. While the law cannot restore what you've taken from them, it can ensure you do not continue your predations. I hope you spend your sentence contemplating the damage you've done to lives that deserved better than your lies." Outside the courthouse, the 7 women who'd testified stood together in the autumn sunshine, looking dazed. Clara lit a cigarette with shaking hands. Beth cried quietly while Harriet stood beside her in solid, silent support. And Lydia felt the weight she'd been carrying since Morrison Station finally began to lift. "It's not enough," she said to Jonah, who'd watched the proceedings from the back of the courtroom. 15 years doesn't undo the damage he caused. "No," Jonah agreed. "But it's justice working the way it should. Slowly, imperfectly, but working." He looked at the women gathered on the courthouse steps. "What happens to them now?" "That depends on what they choose," Lydia said, and meant it. "Clara's talking about opening a restaurant in Lodgepole. Says she's tired of cooking for free when she's good enough to charge for it. Harriet wants to try homesteading. She's been studying the land claims process, thinks she can make it work. And Beth has to deal with Jack Morrison, Jonah finished grimly. Margaret's working on it, but it's complicated. If the marriage certificate is legitimate, which it appears to be, Beth is legally his wife. Getting an annulment will require proving the marriage was fraudulent from the start, which means proving Thomas had no authority to perform it, which means finding the supposed preacher and getting him to testify. And if we can't prove it was fraudulent, then Beth has to stay married to a man she never chose or run far enough that Jack Morrison can't find her. Jonah's expression was bleak. This is why your verification service matters, Lydia. These tangles, these legal nightmares that trap women in situations they never agreed to, they're preventable if someone checks the legitimacy of proposals before women invest everything in them. That night, back at the crossroads, they celebrated the verdict with a dinner that Sarah had spent all day preparing. The Tucker children decorated the kitchen with late-season wildflowers. Ben produced a bottle of whiskey he'd been saving for special occasions. And for a few hours, they let themselves believe that justice had been served, and the future looked brighter than the past. But later, after the others had gone to bed, Lydia sat on the porch and thought about all the ways the system had failed the women she'd met. Beth, legally tied to a man she'd never consented to marry. Emma Callahan, missing for 6 years with no justice possible because her disappearance couldn't be proven. The 23 women Thomas had conned, most of whom would never recover what they'd lost, and the countless others who were even now reading matrimonial advertisements, hoping for partnership and finding only exploitation. 15 years in prison for Thomas Whitmore was something, but it wasn't enough. It would never be enough until the circumstances that made women desperate changed, until they had resources and options and the fundamental right to choose their own futures without risking everything on a stranger's promises. The crossroads was a start. The verification service would be another step. But Lydia could see years of work stretching ahead, each small victory overshadowed by the enormity of what still needed changing. "Can't sleep?" Jonah's voice came from the darkness beyond the porch. "Thinking," Lydia said, "about how much work there is to do. How many women need help we can't provide? How inadequate everything we've built feels against the scope of the problem." Jonah climbed the steps and settled into the chair beside hers, his presence solid and oddly comforting. "You know what I learned chasing Thomas Whitmore for 6 years? You can't solve every problem. You can't save every victim. All you can do is the next right thing, and then the next one after that, and eventually you look back and realize you've built something that matters." "Is that what we've built?" Lydia asked, genuinely uncertain. "Something that matters?" "Yes," Jonah said simply. "Claire's going to open a restaurant because she spent 2 months here remembering she's good at something other than survival. Harriet's going to homestead because she learned she can read land law and file claims. Beth's going to fight for her freedom because she watched other women fight for theirs. That's not inadequate, Lydia. That's transformation." Transformation. The word settled into Lydia's chest like a promise. Not rescue, not salvation, just the slow, difficult work of helping women transform themselves from victims of circumstances into architects of their own futures. She thought about the woman she'd been at Morrison's station, desperate, ashamed, waiting for a man who was never coming. And she thought about who she was now, building something that might prevent other women from experiencing that same devastating weight. The change wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It was just the accumulation of choices, each one affirming that she had agency, that her life belonged to her, that waiting for rescue had nearly destroyed her and choosing to act had saved her. "Thank you," Lydia said quietly, "for giving me the chance to fight back, for believing I was capable of more than just being a victim." "You gave yourself that chance," Jonah corrected. "I just provided the opportunity. Everything else, the crossroads, the women you've helped, the verification service you're building, that's all you." They sat in companionable silence as the stars wheeled overhead and the frontier night wrapped around them. And Lydia Hartwell, who'd come west expecting marriage and found betrayal, who'd been abandoned and had turned abandonment into purpose, finally understood something fundamental about her own transformation. She hadn't stopped waiting because she'd been rescued. She'd stopped waiting because she'd rescued herself. And in learning how to do that, she discovered she could help others do the same. That was the real work of the crossroads. Not providing refuge, though they did that. Not distributing information, though that mattered. But teaching women that waiting for someone else to fix their circumstances was a trap, and that the power to transform their lives had always belonged to them. They just needed time and space and resources to remember it. Winter arrived early that year, bringing snow that transformed the valley into something stark and beautiful and unforgiving. The crossroads settled into a rhythm dictated by weather and necessity, with 9 women now living in the bunkhouse and main house, each at different stages of deciding what came next. Claire had left in October to open her restaurant in Lodgepole, writing weekly letters full of complaints about suppliers and satisfaction about finally being her own boss. But her departure had made room for others. Women Morrison sent from stage stops. Women Margaret Fletcher referred after legal consultations. Women who'd heard whispers about a place where abandoned brides could find refuge without judgment. Beth remained, caught in legal limbo, while Abigail Marsh worked to untangle the fraudulent marriage that bound her to Jack Morrison. The supposed preacher had been located in Colorado, but getting him to testify required money Beth didn't have, and time that seemed to stretch endlessly. She'd taken over most of the teaching duties from Sarah, discovering she had patience for helping others learn, even when her own future remained uncertain. "I can't decide what comes next until I know whether I'm legally free," Beth explained one evening while helping Lydia prepare supper. Snow fell steadily outside the kitchen window, accumulating in drifts that would make travel impossible for days. "But I can help other women learn to read contracts so they don't end up trapped like me. That feels like something, at least." It was something. Lydia had watched Beth transform from the tearful girl who'd arrived in August to someone who could stand in front of a classroom and explain the difference between legitimate land claims and fraudulent schemes. The change wasn't dramatic. Beth still cried easily, still struggled with confidence, but she was building something inside herself that couldn't be taken away by circumstances or predators. The verification service had officially launched in November, after Abigail finished drafting the legal framework, and Margaret helped place advertisements in Eastern newspapers. The first inquiry arrived 2 weeks later. A widow from Boston considering a proposal from a cattle rancher near Cheyenne. She'd paid the $5 fee and waited while Jonah investigated the claim. The rancher turned out to be legitimate, prosperous, and genuinely looking for partnership rather than exploitation. Jonah's report confirmed everything the man had promised in his advertisement, and the widow traveled west with confidence instead of desperate hope. "That's what success looks like," Sarah said when they received the widow's thank you letter. "Not stopping fraud, though that matters, but giving women enough information to make real choices instead of gambling on strangers' promises." The second inquiry was less straightforward. A school teacher from Philadelphia, Lydia felt an uncomfortable kinship when she read the woman's circumstances, had received a proposal from a mining company foreman in Montana Territory. The foreman claimed to own property and stock in the mining operation, promised steady income and a house in town rather than a remote camp. But when Jonah investigated through his network of former lawmen, he discovered the foreman was deeply in debt. The house belonged to the mining company and came with the job, and the stock certificates were worthless paper from a played-out claim. Reporting those findings to the school teacher had felt like crushing someone's hope. But when the woman wrote back thanking them for saving her from financial ruin, Lydia understood they were providing something more valuable than hope. They were providing truth. And truth, however harsh, gave women the power to choose differently. By December, they'd processed 23 inquiries and uncovered fraud in 7 cases. The fee income wasn't enough to make the crossroads financially sustainable, but it helped offset expenses and proved the concept worked. More importantly, word was spreading. Women's groups in Boston and New York had started referring members who were considering Western matrimonial proposals. Stage stop operators were handing out cards with the crossroads address, and several legitimate ranchers had voluntarily submitted to verification, understanding that the stamp of approval gave them credibility with prospective brides. "We're changing the system," Jonah said during one of his weekly visits, stamping snow from his boots before entering the warm kitchen. "Slowly, incrementally, but actually changing it. Men who refuse verification are starting to raise red flags. Women are learning to demand references and documented claims. It's working." But success brought complications. Jack Morrison had returned 3 times, always with variations of the same demand, that Beth returned to him as his legal wife. Each time Ben or Jonah had turned him away with threats of trespassing charges, but everyone knew the situation couldn't continue indefinitely. Either Beth's marriage would be annulled, which required the preacher's testimony and enough money to pursue legal action, or she'd have to run far enough that Morrison couldn't find her, or she'd have to accept being legally bound to a man she'd never chosen. "We need to raise money for Beth's legal fees," Lydia said during a house meeting in early December. The 9 women currently residing at the crossroads gathered in the main house parlor, a fire crackling in the hearth while snow piled against the windows. "Abigail estimates it will cost $200 to bring the preacher from Colorado and pursue the annulment properly. That's more than our verification income can cover." "We could hold a fundraising event," suggested Mary Patterson, a former shopgirl who'd been abandoned at Morrison Station in October. "A dinner, maybe, or a dance. Charge admission, serve food, raise awareness about what we're doing here." "Who would come?" Beth asked quietly. "Most people think we're troublemakers, interfering with natural order. They're not going to pay money to support our work." "Some people think that," Lydia acknowledged, "but others understand what we're providing. The Women's Auxiliary in Lodgepole has been supportive. Several ranchers' wives have donated supplies. And there are men like Jonah who see the value in what we're building." "What about the women we've helped?" Harriet Chen spoke up from her corner near the fire, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd developed over months of observation. "Claire's making money now. That widow who married the Cheyenne rancher sent a thank you letter with a donation. If we reached out to everyone who's passed through here or used our verification service, we might raise enough to help Beth and fund operations through winter." The idea took root quickly. Over the next week, they drafted letters to every woman who'd stayed at the crossroads and every woman who'd used the verification service. Sarah handled the correspondence while Lydia worked with Abigail to ensure the fundraising complied with territorial law. Beth tried to protest that she didn't deserve so much effort on her behalf, but Lydia shut down that argument immediately. "This isn't just about you," Lydia said firmly. "It's about establishing precedent. If we can help you escape a fraudulent marriage, we prove that women aren't permanently trapped by circumstances or paperwork. That matters for everyone." The responses started arriving in mid-December. Clara sent $20 with a note promising more once her restaurant's winter earnings came in. The Boston widow sent $50 and a letter praising the verification service for saving her from potential disaster. Women who'd stayed at the crossroads sent smaller amounts, $2, $5, whatever they could spare, accompanied by messages of support and gratitude. Even some of the ranchers whose claims Jonah had verified sent donations, understanding that the crossroads' credibility benefited them as much as the women seeking honest partnerships. By Christmas, they'd raised $340, enough for Beth's legal fees with substantial overflow for operations. The money arrived in small increments from scattered sources, each contribution representing a woman who understood what the crossroads meant because she'd needed something similar herself. "It's working," Jonah said on Christmas Eve, counting the donations in the ranch office while Lydia recorded amounts in the ledger. Not just the verification service or the refuge, the whole concept, women helping women build something that makes everyone more secure. That's revolutionary, Lydia. It's necessary, Lydia corrected, but she couldn't quite suppress her smile. Revolutionary makes it sound radical and dangerous. We're just providing information and temporary housing. "You're threatening the system that keeps women dependent and exploitable," Jonah countered. "That's absolutely radical and dangerous to men who profit from that system. Don't underestimate what you've built here just because it seems practical to you." The Christmas celebration that evening was modest but genuine. Sarah had managed to produce a feast despite winter limitations. Roasted chicken, potatoes, preserved vegetables, bread still warm from the oven, and a cake that the Tucker children had decorated with elaborate and slightly chaotic enthusiasm. They gathered around the extended kitchen table, 11 women and 1 family, united by circumstances that had tried to break them and a determination to build something better from the wreckage. Beth stood to offer a toast, her hands shaking slightly but her voice steady. 6 months ago, I thought my life was over. I'd been abandoned, lied to, trapped in a marriage I never consented to. I was invisible and powerless and convinced I deserved what happened to me. She looked around the table at faces illuminated by lamplight and firelight, each woman carrying her own history of disappointment and survival. But this place, all of you, taught me something different. You taught me that being abandoned wasn't failure, it was escape. That being invisible meant I could choose who to become when I was ready to be seen again. And that power doesn't come from circumstances or husbands or money. It comes from knowing you deserve better and refusing to accept less. Several women wiped tears from their eyes. Even Sarah, who prided herself on practical stoicism, looked suspiciously moist around the eyes. Lydia felt her throat tighten with emotion she'd been holding carefully at bay for months. The recognition that what they'd built here mattered in ways she was only beginning to understand. After dinner, as they cleaned up and prepared for bed, Jonah pulled Lydia aside. "I need to tell you something about Emma." The shift in his tone made Lydia set down the dish she'd been drying and give him her full attention. They moved to the parlor for privacy, settling into chairs near the dying fire. Outside, snow continued to fall in the darkness, burying the valley under winter's weight. "I've stopped looking for her," Jonah said quietly, his eyes on the flames rather than Lydia's face. "Really stopped. Not just said I was stopping while still following leads. Thomas Whitmore is in prison for 15 years, but he's never going to tell me what happened to Emma. And I've spent 6 years chasing a ghost instead of living my own life." "That must be a difficult decision," Lydia said carefully, understanding this was not about her opinion, but about him articulating something he needed to say aloud. "It's liberating and devastating at the same time," Jonah admitted. "Part of me feels like I'm abandoning her all over again, giving up when she might still be out there somewhere needing help. But another part recognizes that the best way to honor Emma is to do work that prevents other sisters from disappearing. The Crossroads does that. The Verification Service does that. Actually helping women in the present instead of chasing the past. That feels like something Emma would approve of." "You've built something that matters," Lydia said softly. "Emma's disappearance was the catalyst, but what you've created extends far beyond one tragedy. That's not abandonment, that's transformation." Jonah finally met her eyes, and Lydia saw something raw and honest in his expression. "I couldn't have done this without you. The land was always here, and the intention was there, but I didn't know how to turn abstract ideals into practical reality. You did that. You took a vague notion of helping women and made it into an actual functioning operation with structure and sustainability." "We did it together," Lydia corrected. "Your resources, my determination, Sarah's organizational skills, Morrison's network, Margaret and Abigail's legal expertise. This isn't any single person's achievement." "Maybe not." Jonah leaned back in his chair, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "But I think Emma would have liked you. She was stubborn too, convinced she could do anything if she just worked hard enough. That's what got her killed, probably. That same stubborn belief that she could handle whatever the frontier threw at her. Or maybe she's still alive somewhere," Lydia offered gently. "Still stubborn, still surviving, just choosing not to come back to Missouri because she's built something different for herself." "Maybe." Jonah's smile was sad but genuine. "I've made my peace with not knowing. That's the best I can do." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the fire settle and the house creak under its burden of snow. Somewhere upstairs, muffled laughter drifted down as the women prepared for bed, their voices carrying the easy camaraderie of people who'd learned to trust each other through shared adversity. "What happens next?" Jonah asked eventually. "With the Crossroads, I mean. You've got the verification service working, donations coming in, women being helped. But this can't be your whole life forever. At some point, you'll want something for yourself beyond managing other women's crises." The question caught Lydia off guard. She'd been so focused on immediate problems and practical solutions that she hadn't thought much about her own future beyond the next season, the next woman who needed help, the next crisis that required solving. What did she want? The question felt almost foreign after months of subjugating her own needs to the demands of keeping the Crossroads functioning. "I don't know," she admitted. 6 months ago, I wanted marriage and security and someone to share my life with. But that was desperation talking, not genuine desire. Now I'm not sure what I want beyond continuing this work and making it sustainable." "You could have marriage and security and still run the Crossroads," Jonah pointed out. Those things aren't mutually exclusive, aren't they? Lydia thought about the women upstairs, most of whom had sought marriage because it seemed like the only path to security, only to discover that marriage to the wrong man destroyed whatever security they'd hoped to gain. I've seen what happens when women prioritize partnership over independence. They lose themselves. They become extensions of their husband's ambitions rather than people with their own goals. That's not partnership, Jonah said quietly. That's ownership. Real partnership means two people building something together while maintaining their individual identities. It means supporting each other's goals, not subsuming them. And how many marriages actually work that way? Lydia challenged. How many women get to keep their own ambitions after marriage? More than you'd think, if they marry the right person. Jonah stood, preparing to leave before the snow made roads completely impassable. He paused at the door, looking back at Lydia. I'm not asking you to marry me, but I am asking you to consider that choosing to run the crossroads forever might be its own kind of trap. You've spent months teaching women that they deserve more than survival, that they deserve fulfillment and partnership and joy. Don't forget to apply those lessons to yourself. He left before Lydia could formulate a response, riding north through the storm toward his own ranch, and leaving her with thoughts that kept her awake long after everyone else had gone to bed. Was she trapped by the crossroads? Had she traded one form of desperate waiting for Thomas Whitmore and marriage and rescue for another form, for women to help and problems to solve and purpose that came from other people's needs rather than her own desires? The question haunted her through the rest of winter as the crossroads continued to grow and evolve. Beth's annulment proceedings finally began in January, with the Colorado preacher reluctantly testifying that Thomas Whitmore had paid him $50 to perform fake ceremonies for women he was conning. The marriage certificate was declared fraudulent, and Beth was legally free by February. She cried for 3 days straight, not from sadness, but from relief so profound it had to find release. I can choose now, Beth said when the tears finally stopped. Really choose. Where to go, what to do, who to become. That's terrifying and wonderful at the same time. Terrifying and wonderful. Lydia understood that combination intimately. The crossroads had given her purpose and identity and a reason to get up every morning, but it had also become her entire life. She hadn't been off the ranch property in months, hadn't thought about her own future beyond the next verification inquiry or the next woman who needed help, hadn't considered whether she wanted something beyond the satisfaction of helping others learn to want things for themselves. March brought the first signs of spring and a letter from Clara that changed everything. Her restaurant was thriving, but she'd taken on more business than she could handle alone. She wanted to hire women from the crossroads, women who'd learned kitchen skills but needed steady employment to build independent futures. She could pay wages, provide housing, and offer the kind of stability that allowed women to save money and make long-term plans. This is what we've been working toward, Sarah said when they discussed Clara's offer at a house meeting. Women leaving here for actual opportunities, not just escaping crisis. This proves the model works. 3 women accepted Clara's offer immediately, departing in early April with references from Lydia and promises to write about their progress. Their departure left the bunkhouse feeling empty, but also triumphant. They'd helped women transform from abandoned and desperate to employed and planning futures. That was the whole point of the crossroads, but watching them actually leave felt more final than Lydia had expected. You're grieving, Jonah observed when he found her standing alone on the porch, watching the road where the women had disappeared toward Lodgepole. That's natural. You invested months in helping them, and now they're gone. I'm not grieving, Lydia protested, then reconsidered. Or maybe I am. I knew they'd leave eventually. That's the goal. Women staying long enough to rebuild and then moving on to better circumstances. But watching it actually happen makes me realize how much of my identity has become tied to being needed here. And what happens when you're not needed anymore? Jonah settled into the chair beside hers, a position that had become familiar over the long winter. When the crossroads is running smoothly enough that Sarah and Ben can manage without you constantly solving problems. I don't know. The admission felt dangerous, like acknowledging weakness that might be exploited. This place has been my purpose for 6 months. Without it, I'm just another woman who answered a matrimonial advertisement and got lucky enough to escape. You're so much more than that. Jonah's voice carried frustration and something else Lydia couldn't quite identify. You're the woman who built a verification service that's changing how matrimonial arrangements work across 3 territories. You're the woman who created a refuge that's helped 20 women rebuild their lives. You're the woman who testified against Thomas Whitmore and inspired 6 other women to do the same. Your purpose exists independent of the crossroads, Lydia. The crossroads is just one expression of who you are. And who am I? The question came out more vulnerable than Lydia intended. I don't know anymore. I used to be Charles Hartwell's daughter, then Jonathan Hartwell's dependent sister, then a finishing school teacher, then Thomas Whitmore's abandoned fiancée. Now I'm the woman who runs the crossroads. But underneath all those roles, who am I actually? Jonah was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful in the spring sunlight. When he finally spoke, his words were careful, measured. You're someone who sees problems and solves them. Someone who refuses to accept that bad circumstances are inevitable. Someone who learned from her own near disaster and turned that knowledge into protection for others. You're stubborn and principled and occasionally infuriating when you won't accept help because you think it makes you dependent. He paused, a slight smile touching his mouth. And you're someone I've come to care about more than I probably should, given that I'm supposed to be your business partner and nothing else. The confession hung in the air between them, changing something fundamental about their carefully maintained professional distance. Lydia's heart kicked against her ribs as she processed what Jonah had just said. Not a proposal, not a demand, just an honest acknowledgement of feelings that had been building through months of working together. I don't know how to do this, Lydia said quietly. How to care about someone without losing myself in the relationship. Everything I've seen suggests that women who prioritize partnership end up abandoned or diminished or trapped. Then we figure it out together, Jonah said simply. No promises we can't keep. No expectations that require either of us to become less than we are. Just honest partnership between 2 people who respect each other and want to build something that makes both our lives better. That sounds dangerously reasonable, Lydia said, but she was smiling despite herself. Almost like you've thought about this. I've had 6 months to think about it, Jonah admitted. 6 months of watching you transform from a woman who'd been abandoned into someone who built a refuge for others in the same situation. 6 months of seeing you learn to trust yourself and demand better from the world around you. I didn't plan to fall for you, Lydia, but watching someone become who they're meant to be is pretty compelling. Lydia thought about Thomas Whitmore's letters, full of promises about romance and respect guaranteed. She thought about her own desperate hope that marriage would solve her circumstances. And she thought about the past 6 months, learning that the only reliable partnership was the one she built with herself, trusting her own judgment, respecting her own capabilities, refusing to accept less than she deserved. What Jonah was offering wasn't rescue or security or promises written in elegant script. It was something harder and more honest, the possibility of building something together while maintaining separate identities, of caring about each other without requiring either person to diminish themselves, of partnership that enhanced rather than consumed. I don't know if I'm ready, Lydia said honestly, but I'm willing to consider it. That's more than I could have said 6 months ago. Consideration is enough. Jonah stood, preparing to leave, but looking lighter than he had in months. Take whatever time you need. I'm not going anywhere, and neither are you. We've got work to do here that matters more than rushing into anything. He left, and Lydia sat alone on the porch, thinking about possibility and partnership, and the difference between waiting for someone to save you and choosing to build something alongside someone who saw you as an equal. It wasn't the future she'd imagined when she'd answered Thomas Whitmore's advertisement. It was something stranger and more frightening and infinitely more real. That evening, Beth found her in the garden, planting early-season vegetables while the sun set behind the mountains. The younger woman had been quieter since her annulment, processing freedom like a language she'd forgotten how to speak. Miss Hartwell, Lydia, can I ask you something? Beth knelt beside the row of peas Lydia was planting, her hands automatically helping with the work. Do you ever regret answering Thomas's advertisement? Not because of the crossroads or what we've built, but just, do you wish you'd never been that desperate in the first place? Lydia considered the question seriously, thinking about the woman she'd been at Morrison's station. Humiliated, stranded, convinced her life was over at 27 because she'd trusted the wrong promises. Would she choose to avoid that pain if she could, or had the pain itself been necessary for everything that came after? I regret the circumstances that made me desperate, Lydia said slowly. I regret that society is structured so that women like me have so few options that matrimonial advertisements seem like reasonable solutions. I regret that men like Thomas Whitmore can exploit that desperation with minimal consequences. She paused, placing another seed in the earth with careful precision. But do I regret the specific choices I made that led me here? No. Because those choices, even the ones based on desperation and faulty information, brought me to this place, this work, this understanding of who I am when I'm not performing roles other people have written for me. So the pain was worth it? Beth asked quietly. The pain was inevitable, Lydia corrected. Worth implies I had a choice. I didn't, not really. My circumstances were going to cause pain, whether I stayed in Philadelphia teaching at that finishing school, or came west chasing promises of marriage, or ran away to California, or any other option available to a woman with minimal resources. The pain of having limited choices is built into how society treats women like us. She looked at Beth directly. But what we do with that pain, whether we let it destroy us or transform it into something that helps others, that's where choice exists. And I choose transformation. Beth was quiet for a long moment, her hands still working automatically to plant seeds in the furrows Lydia had prepared. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a determination that reminded Lydia of her own awakening months ago. I'm going to stay in the territory, Beth said. Not here at the crossroads. You need the space for women in immediate crisis, but nearby. Maybe Lodgepole, maybe Cheyenne. Somewhere I can use what I've learned here to help other women navigate contracts and legal systems, and men who think our desperation makes us easy targets. That's a good choice, Lydia said, and meant it. The territory needs women like you, women who understand the systems because they've been victimized by them, who can translate legal language into practical protection. Will you be here? Beth asked. Running the crossroads, I mean. Or will you eventually leave too? The question struck at the heart of what Lydia had been wrestling with since Jonah's confession that afternoon. Would she stay at the crossroads forever, making it her entire identity? Or would she eventually build something that existed independent of managing other women's crises? I honestly don't know, Lydia admitted. But I think maybe that's okay. Maybe not knowing what comes next is just another form of choosing. Deciding that I don't have to have my whole future mapped out as long as I'm making decisions that align with who I want to become. They finished planting as darkness fell, their hands working together in companionable silence. And Lydia thought about seeds and growth and the difference between waiting for harvest and actively cultivating the conditions that made growth possible. The crossroads had taught her that lesson, that transformation wasn't something that happened to you, it was something you built deliberately, one choice at a time, until you looked back and barely recognized the person you'd been before the work began. Spring transformed the valley into something that felt almost like promise made visible. Wildflowers carpeting the hillsides, the creek running high with snowmelt, new calves stumbling on uncertain legs in the pastures. The crossroads hummed with activity as women came and went, each one carrying her own story of betrayal or abandonment, each one leaving with something harder and more valuable than the hope she'd arrived with. By May, they'd helped 32 women and processed over 60 verification inquiries, building a reputation that extended across 4 territories and into the eastern states where desperate women still answered matrimonial advertisements. But success brought scrutiny. The territorial newspaper in Cheyenne ran an editorial questioning whether the crossroads was undermining traditional marriage by encouraging women to doubt men's intentions. A minister in Denver City preached a sermon about the dangers of women refusing their natural dependence on male guidance. And several ranchers who'd been exposed as frauds through the verification service began organizing opposition, claiming the crossroads was destroying legitimate opportunities for frontier settlement by scaring away potential brides. They're afraid, Margaret Fletcher said during a visit in early June. She'd ridden out from Lodgepole with legal documents that needed Lydia's signature and news that made the opposition suddenly more dangerous. Jack Morrison has filed a lawsuit claiming the crossroads interfered with his marriage rights by harboring Beth and providing funds for her annulment. He's asking for damages and an injunction that would shut down your operations." The words landed like a physical blow. Lydia set down the coffee pot she'd been holding and gripped the edge of the kitchen table to steady herself. "He can't do that. Beth's annulment was granted by a territorial judge. The marriage was fraudulent from the start." "He's not challenging the annulment," Margaret clarified. "He's challenging your role in facilitating it. His lawyer is arguing that the Crossroads operates as an illegal interference in marital relations, that you're encouraging women to abandon their husbands, and that your verification service constitutes defamation against men whose reputations you damage with unproven allegations of fraud." Sarah, who'd been kneading bread dough at the counter, stopped working and turned to face them. "That's absurd. We document everything. Every verification is based on actual investigation and evidence." "I know that, and you know that, and any reasonable judge will know that," Margaret said. "But Morrison's found a sympathetic lawyer and enough money to make this a real fight. If he wins, or even if he just makes the litigation expensive enough, he could force you to shut down." Lydia thought about the women upstairs, the women who'd left to build new lives, the women who were even now reading about the Crossroads in newspapers, and planning to travel west with some measure of protection against the predators who'd exploited their predecessors. Everything they'd built over 9 months could collapse, because one man felt entitled to a woman who'd never chosen him. "What do we do?" Lydia asked, forcing herself to focus on solutions rather than panic. "How do we fight this?" "We prove that everything you've done is legal, documented, and serves a legitimate public interest," Margaret said. "We gather testimony from every woman you've helped, every rancher whose verification helped them find honest partners, every stage stop operator who's seen the difference your warning system makes. We demonstrate that the Crossroads doesn't interfere with legitimate marriages. It prevents fraudulent ones from trapping women in the first place." That will take time," Lydia said, already mentally cataloging witnesses and evidence. "And money. Morrison chose his timing well. We're heading into summer when women are most likely to travel west for marriages planned around harvest season. If we're tied up in litigation instead of operating the verification service, women will make decisions without adequate information. Then we work fast." Margaret pulled out papers covered in her precise handwriting. "I've already started drafting our response to the lawsuit. Abigail is coordinating with women's groups back east who want to file supporting briefs, and Jonah is gathering testimony from lawmen across the territory about fraud cases the Crossroads helped expose. We're not fighting this alone." Over the next month, preparing the defense consumed every spare moment. Lydia wrote letters to dozens of women who'd used their services, asking for statements about how the Crossroads, or the verification process, had helped them make informed decisions. Clara closed her restaurant for 3 days to travel back and testify about how the refuge had given her time to rediscover skills that now supported her independent life. Beth worked with Abigail to document exactly how the fraudulent marriage had trapped her, and how the Crossroads support had made escape possible. The responses arrived in a steady stream, women grateful for verification that had confirmed their fiancés were legitimate, women thankful for refuge when they'd been abandoned, women who'd learned to read contracts or recognize fraud patterns, or simply believed they deserved better than the first offer they received. Each statement reinforced that the Crossroads served a genuine need that society refused to acknowledge, that women's desperation wasn't a character flaw to be exploited, but a systemic problem requiring structural solutions. "We have 43 statements," Lydia told Jonah one evening while they reviewed the evidence in the ranch office. 43 women willing to put their names on public record saying the Crossroads protected them from fraud or gave them resources to rebuild their lives. That has to mean something to a judge. "It means we're threatening people who profit from women having no alternatives," Jonah said, his expression grim. "Morrison's not acting alone, Lydia. He's got backing from men who see the Crossroads as the beginning of something larger, women organizing to protect themselves, demanding accountability, refusing to accept that desperation makes them fair game. That terrifies men whose livelihoods depend on women having no choice but to trust strangers' promises." "Good." Lydia felt anger crystallizing into determination. They should be terrified. The system that makes women vulnerable to men like Thomas Whitmore and Jack Morrison is built on the assumption that we'll stay silent and ashamed. Every woman who testifies in this lawsuit is proving that assumption wrong. The hearing was scheduled for mid-July in the Territorial Courthouse in Cheyenne, before Judge William Crawford, who had a reputation for fairness but also for traditional views on women's proper roles. Margaret had warned them that Crawford might be sympathetic to arguments about preserving marital authority, but she also believed he'd respect well-documented evidence and testimony from credible witnesses. "Everything depends on how we frame this," Margaret explained during a strategy session the night before the hearing. They'd gathered in a Cheyenne hotel, Lydia, Sarah, Beth, Clara, Margaret, Abigail, and Jonah, reviewing their case one final time. "We're not arguing that women should avoid marriage or that men are inherently untrustworthy. We're arguing that women deserve the same information and protections in matrimonial arrangements that they'd expect in any other business contract. Frame it as supporting legitimate marriages by eliminating fraudulent ones, and Crawford might see it our way." The courthouse the next morning was packed. News of the case had spread through women's networks and territorial newspapers, drawing spectators who understood this was about more than one refuge or one verification service. This was about whether women had the right to organize their own protection against systemic exploitation, or whether that protection itself could be outlawed as interference with male prerogatives. Jack Morrison sat at the plaintiff's table with his lawyer, a smooth-talking man from Denver City who'd made his reputation defending property rights against territorial regulation. He looked confident, relaxed, like someone who knew the law favored men with grievances against women who'd stepped out of their designated place. Judge Crawford entered with the bailiff's announcement, a gray-haired man in his 60s with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades adjudicating frontier disputes. He surveyed the crowded courtroom with evident surprise, then settled into his chair and called for the plaintiff's opening statement. Morrison's lawyer launched into an argument that painted the Crossroads as a radical organization determined to undermine marriage and family stability. He claimed Lydia was a bitter spinster who'd been rejected by a legitimate suitor and now sought revenge by poisoning other women against matrimony. He argued that the verification service amounted to defamation, that harboring wives who'd left their husbands constituted theft of property, and that the entire operation violated natural law regarding women's dependence on male authority. Listening to herself described as bitter and vengeful and unnaturally independent, Lydia felt rage building in her chest. But Margaret had warned her not to react visibly, not to give Morrison's lawyer any emotional display he could use to reinforce stereotypes about hysterical women. So she sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, and let the accusations wash over her while planning her response. When Margaret stood to present their defense, her voice cut through the courtroom with clinical precision. "Your Honor, the plaintiff's argument rests on several false premises. First, that my client operates a radical organization rather than a legitimate business providing information services and temporary housing. Second, that marriage relationships are exempt from the same fraud protections that apply to every other contractual arrangement. And third, that women have no right to organize mutual protection against predatory behavior." She proceeded to dismantle each premise systematically. The Crossroads was properly registered as a territorial business, paid taxes, maintained documentation of all services provided, and operated within legal boundaries established through consultation with multiple attorneys. The verification service investigated claims made in matrimonial advertisements with the same due diligence any investor would conduct before committing resources, and charged fees comparable to other investigative services. And the refuge provided temporary housing to women in crisis, exactly as churches and charitable organizations had done for decades without legal challenge. "The only difference between the Crossroads and other charitable operations," Margaret said, her voice sharp with controlled anger, "is that my client refuses to moralize about women's circumstances or require religious conversion as a condition of help. She treats these women as rational adults capable of making their own decisions if given adequate information. Apparently that's what the plaintiff finds threatening." Then came the testimony. Clara described arriving at the Crossroads humiliated and broke, leaving months later with skills and confidence that now supported her independent business. Beth explained how a fraudulent marriage had trapped her until the Crossroads provided resources for legal escape. A rancher from Montana testified that verification had helped him find a legitimate wife by giving prospective brides confidence his claims were honest. Morrison from the stage stop described watching women stranded by con men before the Crossroads existed and watching them arrive now with information that protected them from the same fate. The testimony continued through the entire day, 43 women and men standing up to explain how the crossroads had made their lives measurably better. And with each statement, Lydia watched Judge Crawford's expression shift from skeptical neutrality to something that looked almost like understanding. But the moment that changed everything came late in the afternoon, when a woman Lydia had never seen before stood to testify. She was perhaps 40 years old, plainly dressed, with the kind of quiet dignity that came from surviving things that should have destroyed her. "My name is Emma Callahan," she said, and the courtroom went absolutely silent. "6 years ago, I answered a matrimonial advertisement from a man calling himself Thomas Whitmore. I traveled from Missouri to Colorado Territory believing I would marry a prosperous rancher. Instead, I was sold to a brothel in Denver City for $200. Lydia felt the shock ripple through the room. Beside her, Jonah had gone completely still, his face drained of color. Emma Callahan, his sister, the woman he'd spent 6 years searching for, believing she was dead or lost forever. And she was here, alive, testifying in a courtroom about the nightmare that had consumed her life. Thomas Whitmore, whose real name I later learned was David St. Clair, never intended to marry me, Emma continued, her voice steady despite the horrific content. He brought me to Denver City, took the money I'd brought for our new life together, and sold me to a man who ran a brothel disguised as a boarding house. I spent 4 years in that place, unable to leave because I had no money and no legal recourse. The brothel owner claimed I owed him for room and board, and threatened to have me arrested for theft if I tried to escape." Judge Crawford leaned forward, his earlier neutrality replaced by visible horror. "How did you escape, Miss Callahan?" "A client helped me," Emma said simply. "A lawyer who recognized that my situation was involuntary servitude, which is illegal even in brothels. He helped me file charges against the owner, and I testified at his trial last year. He's currently serving 15 years in territorial prison." She paused, looking directly at Jack Morrison. "I spent 4 years trapped by a fraudulent marriage arrangement and a legal system that treated me as property. I finally escaped because one person recognized I deserved protection and helped me access legal resources. That's exactly what the Crossroads does. It provides women with resources to escape fraudulent arrangements before they become inescapable. If the Crossroads had existed 6 years ago, I might have avoided 4 years of hell." The courtroom erupted. Judge Crawford had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. Morrison's lawyer looked stunned, his confident demeanor evaporating as he realized his case for preserving marriage sanctity had just collided with testimony about women being sold into sexual slavery through the same matrimonial system he was defending. Margaret seized the moment. "Your Honor, this is exactly why the Crossroads exists. Not to undermine legitimate marriages, but to prevent predatory men from using matrimonial arrangements as cover for fraud, theft, and worse. My client provides information and refuge, the same things that might have saved Miss Callahan from 4 years of involuntary servitude. The plaintiff wants you to shut down that protection because one woman used it to escape a fraudulent marriage. I submit that Miss Callahan's testimony demonstrates why that protection is desperately necessary." Judge Crawford called a recess. The courtroom emptied slowly, spectators whispering about Emma's revelation. But Lydia watched Jonah move through the crowd toward his sister, watched Emma turn and see him, watched 6 years of grief and guilt and desperate searching resolve into a reunion that made Lydia's throat ache with emotion. They embraced in the courthouse hallway, both crying too hard for words. Lydia turned away to give them privacy, finding Margaret beside her with an expression of fierce satisfaction. "We won," Margaret said quietly. "Crawford won't rule from the bench, but I've worked with him long enough to read his face." Emma's testimony destroyed Morrison's case. No judge wants to be on record shutting down an organization that prevents women from being sold into brothels. "It's not about winning," Lydia said, watching Jonah and Emma still clinging to each other like they were afraid the other might disappear again. "It's about proving that women deserve protection, that the system needs to change, that we have the right to organize our own safety instead of waiting for men to decide we're worth protecting." "That too," Margaret agreed. "But today, in this courtroom, we won. Sometimes that matters." The ruling came 3 days later. Judge Crawford issued a written opinion that rejected Morrison's claims entirely, found that the Crossroads operated within legal boundaries, and specifically noted that verification services protecting women from fraud served legitimate public interest. He went further, suggesting that territorial law should be amended to require verification of claims made in matrimonial advertisements, that women should have legal recourse against men who committed fraud in courtship, and that organizations like the Crossroads deserve the same protections and support as other charitable institutions. The opinion made news across multiple territories. Within weeks, 2 more verification services opened in Colorado and Montana, both modeled on the Crossroads approach. Women's groups in eastern cities started raising money for similar refuges, and several territorial legislatures began considering laws that would regulate matrimonial advertisements and establish penalties for courtship fraud. "You changed the system," Abigail said when she delivered copies of Crawford's opinion to the ranch. "Not completely, not overnight, but actually changed it. Women now have legal standing to challenge fraudulent marriage arrangements." "That's precedent, Lydia. That's revolutionary." But Lydia was watching Jonah and Emma through the kitchen window, sitting together on the porch and talking with the intensity of people trying to compress 6 years of separation into a few hours of conversation. Emma had agreed to stay at the Crossroads temporarily while she decided her next steps, and the reunion between siblings had been both joyful and painful as they confronted everything that had been lost to Thomas Whitmore's greed. "She's not the same person she was," Jonah had told Lydia the night after Emma's testimony. "How could she be after what she survived? But she's stronger than I gave her credit for. She escaped. She testified. She helped put that brothel owner in prison. She survived, and then she transformed survival into justice. I spent 4 years in a situation where every choice was made for me, where my body and my time and my future belonged to someone else. The idea of voluntarily giving someone else authority over any part of my life feels dangerous." "Exactly," Lydia said, relieved someone understood. "Every marriage I've seen involves women subsuming their goals to their husband's ambitions. I've built something here that matters, and I'm terrified of losing it to domesticity." "Then don't," Emma said simply. "Marry Jonah if you want to, but keep running the Crossroads. Keep building your verification service. Keep doing work that makes the territory safer for women. Partnership doesn't have to mean subsumption unless you let it." "But how do you prevent it?" Lydia asked, voicing the fear that had kept her from accepting what she felt for Jonah. "How do you maintain independence while building a life with someone?" "The same way you prevent any kind of exploitation, with clear boundaries, documented expectations, and the willingness to walk away if those boundaries aren't respected." Emma's voice carried hard-won wisdom. "You write it into the marriage contract if necessary. You maintain separate property. You keep your own income and your own identity. And you choose a partner who respects your autonomy enough to never ask you to diminish yourself." "Do you think Jonah would accept that?" Lydia asked quietly. "I think Jonah spent 6 years searching for me because he couldn't accept that I'd been lost to a predatory system," Emma said. "And I think watching you build something that prevents other sisters from disappearing matters to him as much as it matters to you. He's not going to ask you to give up the Crossroads, Lydia. He's going to ask if he can help you build it into something even more substantial." That evening, after the others had gone to bed, Lydia found Jonah on the porch where so many of their important conversations had taken place. The summer night was warm, cricket song filling the darkness, stars scattered across the sky in brilliant profusion. "Emma thinks I should marry you," Lydia said without preamble, settling into the chair beside his. "She says partnership doesn't require subsumption if both people respect boundaries and maintain independence." "Emma's smart," Jonah said carefully. "What do you think?" "I think I'm terrified," Lydia admitted. "I've spent 9 months learning that I don't need rescue, that I can build my own future, that waiting for someone else to save me is the trap that nearly destroyed me. Marriage feels like choosing the trap deliberately." "Then don't choose marriage," Jonah said simply. "Choose partnership on whatever terms make sense to you. I don't need a ceremony or a certificate or social recognition. I just want to build something with you, the Crossroads, the verification service, a life that includes both of us working toward goals we believe in. If that looks like traditional marriage, fine. If it looks like something else entirely, that's fine too. I'm not asking you to fit yourself into expectations that don't serve you." Lydia turned to look at him, this man who'd given her the opportunity to fight back against Thomas Whitmore, who'd invested his land and resources in helping women he'd never meet, who'd spent 6 years searching for his sister and now supported her in rebuilding her life without demanding she explain or justify what she'd survived. He wasn't offering rescue. He was offering partnership between equals who'd both learned that strength came from refusing to accept less than you deserved. "I want to keep running the crossroads," Lydia said slowly, testing the words. "I want to expand the verification service into more territories. I want to push for legal reforms that protect women from matrimonial fraud. And I want to do all of that without having to justify my choices or seek permission or diminish my ambitions to make space for someone else's ego." "Then that's what we do," Jonah said. "I'll help where I can, step back where you don't need me, and never ask you to be less than you are. And if we marry, if I decide that's something I want, it would be documented partnership with separate property and equal authority," Lydia continued, building a vision of marriage that looked nothing like what she'd imagined answering Thomas Whitmore's advertisement. "No coverture, no legal subsumption of my identity into yours. Just two people who respect each other and choose to build something together." "Abigail can draft whatever contract makes you feel secure," Jonah offered. "I don't care about legal niceties. I care about you feeling safe enough to build a life that includes partnership without sacrificing independence." Lydia was quiet for a long moment, listening to the night sounds and thinking about the past 9 months. The woman who'd been stranded at Morrison Station would never have believed this conversation was possible. Marriage as negotiated partnership rather than subsumption. Independence as something that could coexist with intimacy. Strength as something that grew through connection rather than isolation. "Ask me again in 3 months, Lydia said finally. "After we've expanded the verification service and established the legal precedents from Crawford's ruling. After Emma's decided what she wants to do next. After I've had time to see if this," she gestured between them, "stays consistent when it's not built on crisis and necessity." 3 months, Jonah agreed. "And if the answer's still no, I'll ask again in 6 months. And if it's still no after that, I'll accept it, and we'll figure out how to be partners and friends without anything more." "You're infuriatingly reasonable," Lydia said, but she was smiling. "One of us has to be," Jonah replied. "You've cornered the market on stubborn determination." The 3 months that followed were among the most productive of Lydia's life. They expanded the verification service to cover 6 territories, hired 2 additional investigators to handle the volume of inquiries, and established partnerships with women's organizations in 12 eastern cities who referred members considering Western matrimonial proposals. The Crossroads added a second bunkhouse to accommodate more residents, hired a teacher to provide more comprehensive education, and began offering apprenticeships with local businesses for women who wanted to learn trades rather than pursue marriage. Emma decided to stay in the territory, accepting a position with Abigail's law practice as an investigator specializing in cases involving fraud and exploitation. She moved to Cheyenne but visited the Crossroads monthly, her presence a reminder that survival wasn't the end of the story. What you built from survival was what ultimately mattered. Clara's restaurant expanded to a second location, employing 8 women who'd passed through the Crossroads and needed steady work. Beth opened a school for frontier literacy, teaching reading and contract interpretation to women across 3 territories. Harriet Chen successfully filed a homestead claim and was building a farm that demonstrated mixed-race women could thrive independent of marriage or family support. And Lydia watched the Crossroads transform from an emergency response to one man's fraud into a functioning system that was changing how women approached Western settlement. The verification service had investigated over 200 matrimonial proposals, exposing fraud in 38 cases and confirming legitimacy in the rest. Women traveled west now with information and protection, with resources and alternatives, with the understanding that desperation didn't have to mean accepting the first offer they received. 3 months to the day after their conversation on the porch, Jonah asked again, "Have you decided?" They were standing in the new bunkhouse, inspecting carpentry work that had just been completed. The building smelled of fresh sawdust and possibility, ready to house women who would arrive desperate and leave transformed. "Yes," Lydia said, "I want partnership. I want to build a life with you that includes the Crossroads and the verification service and whatever else we decide to create. I want marriage on terms that protect my independence and respect my work. And I want all of that knowing that I could survive without you, that I've built something sustainable that doesn't depend on rescue or partnership, that choosing you is exactly that, a choice, not a necessity. Jonah's smile was slow and genuine and full of a relief she hadn't realized he'd been carrying. Then let's do it. However you want it structured, whatever terms make you feel secure, however public or private you want the ceremony to be. This is your choice, Lydia. Make it on your terms. They married in September, 1 year after Thomas Whitmore's trial, in a ceremony that looked nothing like traditional frontier weddings. Abigail drafted a marriage contract that preserved Lydia's separate property, established equal authority over household decisions, and specifically protected her right to continue operating the crossroads without spousal permission. Margaret served as witness. Emma stood beside Lydia, solid and present and living proof that survival could transform into thriving. The women currently residing at the crossroads decorated the ranch with late-season wildflowers and cooked a feast that filled the house with warmth and celebration. "I object to this marriage," Clara announced dramatically during the ceremony, then grinned at the shocked faces around her. "Just kidding, but someone needed to say it since we're all thinking how thoroughly this violates traditional expectations." The gathering dissolved into laughter. Because that was the point, wasn't it? Violating expectations that said women's desperation should be exploited rather than addressed, that marriage required subsumption rather than partnership, that waiting for rescue was safer than choosing to save yourself. That night, lying beside Jonah in the home they would now share, Lydia thought about the journey from Morrison Station to this moment. She'd been abandoned, humiliated, left stranded with $4 to her name and no apparent future. And from that disaster, she'd built something that mattered. Not just the crossroads or the verification service, but an understanding of her own strength and worth that didn't depend on anyone else's validation. "What are you thinking?" Jonah asked quietly, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "That I'm grateful Thomas Whitmore abandoned me," Lydia said, and meant it. Not for the pain or humiliation, but because being forced to save myself taught me I could. If he'd actually shown up, if he'd married me and taken me to some non-existent ranch, I would have spent my life as someone's dependent wife instead of becoming who I am now. "And who are you now?" Jonah asked. Lydia considered the question seriously. She was the founder of an organization that had helped over 50 women rebuild their lives. She was the architect of a verification service that was changing how matrimonial arrangements worked across multiple territories. She was a woman who'd testified against the man who'd tried to exploit her desperation, who'd fought for legal reforms that protected other women, who'd transformed personal disaster into systemic change. But more fundamentally, she was someone who'd learned that waiting for rescue was the real trap, that strength came from refusing to accept less than you deserved, and that the only reliable partnership was one built on mutual respect between people who didn't need each other but chose each other anyway. "I'm someone who stopped waiting," Lydia said finally. "Everything else follows from that." Outside, the wind moved through the valley, carrying the scent of sage and approaching autumn. The crossroads would continue its work through another winter, another spring, another cycle of women arriving desperate and leaving transformed. The verification service would expand and evolve, pushing for regulations and protections that would eventually become law. And Lydia would build a life that honored both independence and partnership, proving that the two weren't contradictory but complementary. She'd come west expecting marriage and security, chasing promises written in elegant script by a man who didn't exist. Instead, she'd found something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that she could build her own security, create her own purpose, and choose partnership from a position of strength rather than desperation. Thomas Whitmore had been right about one thing. There were 100 men like him in the territory, maybe more, ready to exploit women's vulnerable circumstances. But what he'd failed to understand was that women who'd survived exploitation once learned to recognize it, and women who'd learned to save themselves could teach others to do the same. The frontier was still harsh and unforgiving, still full of men who saw women's desperation as opportunity. But now it also contained women who refused to be invisible, who organized mutual protection, who demanded better and built systems to ensure other women could do the same. That was revolution. Not dramatic or sudden, but built incrementally through individual acts of courage and collective organization. One woman testifying against her con man, one refuge offering alternatives to acceptance of bad circumstances, one verification service confirming that some promises were worth trusting while others were lies designed to trap. Lydia Hartwell had stopped waiting at Morrison Station, and in choosing to act rather than accept, she'd discovered something the frontier desperately needed. Women who understood that transformation wasn't something that happened to you, but something you built deliberately, one choice at a time, until you looked back and barely recognized the desperate woman who'd once believed that marriage was the only path to security. She'd been wrong about that. Security came from knowing you could survive alone. Partnership came from choosing to build something alongside someone who respected your strength rather than exploiting your weakness. And the future, the real future, not the one promised in matrimonial advertisements, belonged to women brave enough to stop waiting and start choosing. That was the lesson of the crossroads. That was the truth Thomas Whitmore's lies had inadvertently revealed. That was the foundation of everything Lydia would build in the years ahead, as the refuge grew into a network spanning territories, as verification became standard practice, as laws changed to reflect that women deserved protection rather than exploitation. She'd been abandoned at a godforsaken stage stop with nothing but a carpet bag and broken promises. And from that abandonment, she'd built a legacy that would outlast any marriage, any individual life, any single act of courage. She'd built transformation itself. And nothing, not predatory men, not traditional expectations, not legal challenges or social criticism, could take that away. The woman who'd once waited on a bench outside Morrison Station was gone, transformed into someone who created space for other women to stop waiting too. And that transformation, hard-won and deliberately chosen, was worth more than any promise ever written in elegant script by a stranger selling lies. No more waiting, no more accepting. Just forward, into a future she would build with her own hands and her own choices, partnered but never diminished, secure in the knowledge that strength came from within and everything else was negotiable. That was enough. That was everything. That was the life she'd chosen instead of the life that had been promised, and it was infinitely better for being real.